February 8, 1876, marked the beginning of a life forged in the dust and iron of Fort Concho, Texas, where the wind carried the stinging grit of the plains and the sharp scent of gun oil. In the quarters of the 10th Cavalry, Sergeant George Goldsby looked down at his newborn son, Crawford Goldsby, a child born into a world defined by the violent intersection of three distinct bloodlines and the unforgiving hierarchy of the frontier army. The boy entered existence on the edge of the staked plains, a desolate expanse where the buffalo soldiers of the 10th Cavalry rode patrols to enforce a peace that the local white population in San Angelo barely tolerated. Crawford screamed his first breath in a wooden embrace of military housing, the son of a respected black sergeant and Ellen Beck, a woman of mixed Cherokee, white, and African ancestry. San Angelo sat across the river from the fort, a parasitic settlement of saloons, gambling halls, and brothels that thrived on the soldiers' pay while despising their presence. The tension in the air was as palpable as the heat rising from the hard-packed earth. George Goldsby walked a razor's edge every day he wore the blue uniform. He carried himself with the rigid discipline of a man who knew that one misstep meant ruin. Yet the uniform offered no shield against the racial hatred simmering across the Concho River. Young Crawford spent his first years watching the daily drills on the parade ground, absorbing the sights of sabers flashing in the sun and the rhythmic thud of carbine butts hitting the dirt. The military cadence became the background noise of his infancy, a structured order that masked the chaos waiting just beyond the sentry lines. The precarious balance of their lives shattered violently in February of 1878. The simmering animosity between the town's cowboys and the black troopers erupted into open warfare in the Morris Saloon. A group of cowboys and hunters ripped the chevrons from a soldier's uniform and slapped him with the torn fabric, a deliberate provocation that demanded blood. George Goldsby, despite his rank and his family, found himself pulled into the center of the conflict. He gathered his men, armed them with government-issued carbines, and marched into town to confront the mob. The ensuing firefight turned the dusty streets of San Angelo into a kill box. Bullets tore through wood and flesh alike, leaving men dead and the fragile truce between fort and town destroyed. Facing a certain court-martial and the likelihood of a lynching by the Texas Rangers, George Goldsby made the only choice that ensured his survival. He cut the telegraph wires leading out of the fort to delay pursuit and vanished into the vast darkness of the Texas night. He left behind his career, his reputation, and his family. Crawford, barely a toddler, lost the only figure of authority he had ever known. The abandonment struck the family with the force of a physical blow. Ellen Beck found herself alone in a hostile territory with 2 children, branded by her association with a fugitive soldier. The army, the institution that had provided their housing and rations, now viewed them as the remnants of a traitor. Ellen gathered what little she possessed and fled the hostile plains of Texas, taking Crawford and his sister to Fort Gibson in the Cherokee Nation. The landscape shifted from the arid scrub of West Texas to the rolling green hills and timber of Indian Territory. Here, the laws of the United States government held a tenuous grip, constantly clashing with the sovereignty of the tribal courts. Ellen relied on her Cherokee heritage to secure a place for them, moving in with an aunt near the fort. Crawford grew from a toddler into a boy in this chaotic environment, where the jurisdiction of federal marshals ended at the tree line and outlaws found easy refuge among the populace. The boy's life took another sharp turn when Ellen married William Lynch. Lynch was a man of the earth, a Kansas City native who had served as a private in the army before turning his hand to labor. He brought a stepfather's strictness to the household without the tempering affection of a blood bond. Lynch viewed Crawford not as a son but as a problem to be managed, a wild colt that required breaking. He demanded obedience and hard labor, forcing the boy to work the land and tend to the livestock. Crawford, carrying the volatile temperament of his absent father, chafed under Lynch's rule. The two circled each other with growing hostility, the tension in the small house thickening with every reprimand and every defiant glare. By the time Crawford reached the age for schooling, the friction with Lynch had become unbearable. To instill discipline and remove the boy from the negative influences of the rough frontier towns, Ellen and Lynch sent him to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. The journey took Crawford thousands of miles away from the only world he understood, transporting him from the lawless fringes of the Cherokee Nation to the heart of Eastern civilization's attempt at cultural erasure. Carlisle operated with the precision of a penitentiary. Captain Richard Henry Pratt ran the institution on the philosophy that the Indian must die for the man to live. Crawford stepped off the train into a world of gray uniforms, stiff leather collars, and rigid schedules. The school stripped him of his individuality immediately. They cut his hair short, a traumatic violation of cultural identity for many of the students, and forbade the use of native languages or slang. The whistle and the bell dictated every second of his existence. He woke to a bugle, marched to the mess hall, marched to class, and marched to the workshops. The curriculum at Carlisle focused heavily on vocational training, intending to turn the students into manual laborers and farmers who could serve the white economy. Crawford learned to handle tools, to march in formation, and to suppress his outward emotions. The discipline was physical and relentless. Any infraction met with swift punishment, ranging from extra labor to confinement in the guardhouse. The instructors tolerated no defiance. Crawford existed in this pressure cooker for years, surrounded by hundreds of other displaced youths from dozens of tribes, all subjected to the same systematic stripping of their heritage. Despite the intent to domesticate him, Carlisle hardened Crawford. He learned to hide his anger behind a mask of stoicism, a trait that would serve him well in his later years. He endured the racism of the local Pennsylvania townsfolk during his outing periods, where students were sent to live with white families to learn civilized ways. These experiences reinforced the lesson that he would never be fully accepted in the white world, regardless of how well he wore the uniform or spoke the language. He remained an outsider, too dark for the whites, too mixed for some of the traditionalists back home, and forever marked by the stigma of his father's desertion. He returned to the Cherokee Nation in 1894, a young man of 18, physically transformed by his time in the East. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, with a powerful build developed through years of manual labor and military drills. The boy who had left was gone, replaced by a brooding, muscular figure who moved with a dangerous confidence. He arrived back in Fort Gibson to find that while he had changed, the dynamics of his home had not. William Lynch still ruled the household with an iron fist, and the resentment between the two men reignited instantly. The Indian territory Crawford returned to was a land in turmoil. The federal government was increasing its pressure to dissolve the tribal governments and allot the land, bringing an influx of white settlers, carpetbaggers, and desperate men fleeing warrants in the states. The railroads cut through the nations, bringing commerce and crime in equal measure. Whiskey peddlers operated openly in the brush, selling rot-gut liquor to anyone with coin. The social fabric was fraying, creating a vacuum where violence often settled disputes. Crawford looked at this world with the eyes of a young man who had been told for years that his culture was inferior. Yet he saw the so-called civilized men cheating, stealing, and killing with impunity. He tried briefly to fit into the mold his mother desired. He worked around the house and attempted to coexist with Lynch. The labor was grueling and thankless. Lynch criticized his work, his attitude, and his very presence. The stepfather saw the potential for violence in Crawford's eyes and tried to beat it down with words and hard tasks. One afternoon, the conflict reached its breaking point over a trivial chore involving the feeding of pigs. Lynch berated Crawford, his voice rising in anger, demeaning the young man's efforts. Crawford stood in the muddy yard, the slop bucket heavy in his hand. The years of military discipline at Carlisle, the shame of his father's flight, and the constant grinding pressure of Lynch's disapproval coalesced into a single moment of clarity. He realized he did not have to take it. He was bigger than Lynch now, stronger, and possessed a coldness that the older man lacked. He dropped the bucket. He did not shout back. He simply turned his back on William Lynch and the life of a subjugated stepson. He walked away from the house, leaving the pigs unfed and Lynch shouting impotently in the yard. He went to his mother one last time, not to ask for permission but to state his intentions. He packed his meager belongings, consisting mostly of the clothes on his back and a few personal items. He strapped on a pistol, a tool as essential as a hammer in the territory. The weight of the gun on his hip felt natural, a restoration of the power that had been stripped from him at Carlisle. Crawford drifted to the town of Noata, moving among the fringes of society. He associated with other young men who felt displaced and restless. They drank whiskey in the back rooms of stores and gambled on horse races. The discipline of the school evaporated, replaced by the chaotic freedom of the frontier. He began to carry himself not as a student or a laborer, but as a man who demanded respect. The locals noticed the change. They saw the way he watched the streets, his eyes scanning for threats, his hand never far from his waist. He took up residence with a neighbor for a short time, an elderly woman named Auntie Amanda Foster, doing odd jobs to keep himself fed. It was a temporary arrangement, a pause before the plunge. He was 18 years old, disjointed from his family, alienated from his heritage, and trained in the arts of war by the very government that oppressed his people. The Buffalo Soldier's bastard had returned to the territory, not as the saved man Captain Pratt had promised, but as a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. The spring of 1894 brought the rains that turned the dirt roads of the Cherokee Nation into quagmires. The creek swelled and the green returned to the hills. For Crawford, it was a season of waiting. He frequented the dances and the gatherings in the small communities around Fort Gibson. He stood on the edges of the crowds, watching the girls and the other young men. The tension that had lived inside him since the day George Goldsby rode into the night began to seek an outlet. He had no fear of the law, for the law was a white man's game or a tribal court that he felt little connection to. He respected only force. In the smoky atmosphere of the local gatherings, Crawford began to forge a new reputation. He was no longer just the Goldsby boy. He was becoming something else, a figure of potential menace. He let the locals see his pistol. He let them see the lack of hesitation in his gaze. He was testing the boundaries, pushing against the social constraints to see what would break. The Indian Territory, with its overlapping jurisdictions and hiding spots in the Cookson Hills, offered the perfect stage for his transformation. The psychological break was complete. He severed the emotional ties to his stepfather and, by extension, the stable home life his mother tried to provide. He rejected the white path of Carlisle. He stood alone in the spring mud, a product of violence and abandonment, ready to inflict his own pain upon the world. The lessons of the drill field had taught him how to kill. The lessons of his life had taught him why. The stage was set for the first act of blood. The spring rains of 1894 had finally ceased, leaving the low ground around Fort Gibson heavy with black mud and the air thick with the humidity of the coming summer. On a Saturday evening in late March, the social constraints of the daylight hours dissolved into the raw, frenetic energy of a harvest dance held in a rough-hewn log building on the outskirts of town. The structure vibrated with the stomping of boots on plank floors and the scraping of a fiddle the music spilling out into the darkness where men shared bottles of corn whiskey and rolled cigarettes with tobacco-stained fingers. Inside, the heat was physical, a wall of smell composed of unwashed bodies, stale smoke, and the grease of roasting pork from the hog killing earlier that day. Crawford Goldsby arrived alone, moving through the crowd with the heavy-shouldered gait he had perfected since his return from the East. He wore a dark vest over a collarless shirt, his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the room not for friends but for threats and opportunities. The local girls, daughters of freedmen and Cherokee farmers, spun in the center of the floor, their laughter cutting through the din of the conversation. Crawford leaned against a rough-cut support beam, his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching the movement with a mixture of desire and disdain. He felt the separation acutely. He was of them by blood, yet the years of regimented discipline had forged a layer of cold iron around his demeanor that kept the casual revelry at a distance. Jake Lewis stood near the punch bowl, a man who occupied space with the confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged in a physical confrontation. Lewis was older than Crawford, a laborer with hands scarred from working the railroads and a reputation for using them in a fight. He was a freedman, built like a wall of oak, and he held court with a group of admirers, his loud voice dominating the corner of the room. The conflict began not with words but with a look. Crawford's gaze lingered too long on a girl Lewis considered his territory, a young woman with bright ribbons in her hair who had smiled in the direction of the brooding ex-student. Lewis peeled away from his group and crossed the floor, the crowd parting instinctively as they sensed the shift in the room's energy. He stopped inches from Crawford, the smell of cheap rye whiskey radiating from his skin. The music did not stop, but the people nearest them went quiet, sensing the violence radiating from the older man. Lewis spoke first, his voice a low rumble of mockery, questioning what a schoolboy was doing at a man's gathering. Crawford did not back down. He replied with a sharp insult, a challenge to Lewis's intelligence that cut through the older man's bravado like a knife. The violence was immediate and unglamorous. Lewis did not posture. He struck. His fist, hard as a stone, connected with Crawford's jaw, snapping the younger man's head back and sending his hat flying into the crowd. Crawford staggered, his vision swimming, but he swung back, his knuckles grazing Lewis's cheek. The size difference was insurmountable. Lewis waded through Crawford's defense, landing body blows that drove the wind from his lungs. He grabbed Crawford by the front of his shirt and threw him bodily through the open door, sending him crashing into the mud of the yard. Laughter erupted from the doorway. Crawford lay in the dirt, the taste of copper filling his mouth, his ribs aching with a sharp, throbbing fire. He looked up to see Lewis standing in the frame of light, silhouetted like a giant, wiping his hands on his trousers as if he had just discarded a piece of refuse. The humiliation was total. The physical pain was secondary to the burning shame that clawed at his insides. He scrambled to his feet, slipping in the muck, and heard the jeers of the crowd. They saw a boy who had been disciplined. Crawford saw a death sentence. He did not speak. He did not threaten. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the blackness of the tree line. The music inside started up again, the incident already forgotten by the revelers, dismissed as just another scuffle at a Saturday dance. Crawford walked for 2 miles, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind focusing on a single crystalline objective. He reached the house of a relative where he had been staying and moved through the darkened rooms with the silence of a ghost. He ignored the throbbing in his face. He located a .45 caliber 6 shooter, a heavy piece of steel that felt cold and reassuring in his grip. He checked the cylinder. It was full. The walk back to the dance took less time. The rage gave him energy, propelling him through the brush and the mud. He did not run. He marched with a terrifying purpose. When the lights of the dance hall came back into view, the sounds of the fiddle sounded like a funeral dirge to his ears. He approached the building from the side, avoiding the main path. He stepped up to the open doorway, the light from the kerosene lamp spilling out to illuminate his battered face. Jake Lewis was still there, laughing with a woman near the center of the room. Crawford raised the pistol. His hand did not shake. He did not call out a warning or demand a fair fight. He simply aimed at the center of Lewis's chest and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, louder than the thunder of the planes. The bullet struck Lewis, spinning him around. The music died instantly. Screams replaced the laughter. Lewis did not fall immediately. He staggered, clutching his side, a look of absolute shock replacing his earlier arrogance. Crawford cocked the hammer and fired again. The second shot hit Lewis, dropping him to the floorboards. The crowd scrambled, overturning chairs and tables in a panic to escape the line of fire. Crawford stood in the doorway for a second longer, the smoke from the black powder swirling around him. He looked at the body on the floor, convinced he had just committed murder. He felt no regret, only a grim satisfaction that the balance was restored. He holstered the weapon, turned, and vanished back into the night before the shock of the onlookers could turn into pursuit. He ran now. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He knew the consequences of his action. There would be no trial, no explanation of self-defense. In the territory, a shooting like this meant a warrant from Judge Parker's court in Fort Smith. It meant the marshals would be coming. He headed deep into the Creek Nation, navigating by the stars and the layout of the creeks he had learned in his childhood. He avoided the roads, sticking to the cattle trails and the game paths that wound through the thickets of scrub oak and hickory. For 3 days he lived like an animal. He slept in the hollows of trees and under the overhangs of creek banks, shivering in the damp spring air. He ate wild onions and whatever small game he could kill with a rock, saving his ammunition for the marshals he was sure were tracking him. The isolation gave him time to think, but his thoughts did not turn to repentance. They hardened. He realized that he had crossed a threshold. The Crawford Goldsby who had tried to farm and feed pigs was dead, killed in the mud outside the dance hall. In his place was a fugitive, a man who existed outside the protection of the law. He drifted west, moving towards the darker, wilder parts of the territory, where the writ of the law faded into mere suggestion. It was in this lawless vacuum that he sought out the company of men who would understand his situation. He had heard names whispered in the saloons and the supply stores, names of men who defied the railroads and the marshals. The Cook brothers, Bill and Jim, were already legends in the making, running a network of safe houses and sympathizers throughout the Cherokee and Creek nations. Crawford found them camped near a limestone ridge, a location that offered a clear view of the surrounding approaches. He approached their fire cautiously, his hands visible, the stolen pistol tucked into his belt. Bill Cook, a man with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing, watched him come in. They did not ask him for his life story. They looked at the way he wore his gun, the desperation in his stance and the hardness in his eyes. They saw a recruit. He sat by their fire, accepting a tin plate of beans and salt pork. The food was hot and greasy, the best meal he had eaten in days. As he ate, he listened to their talk. They spoke of the changing territory, of the money flowing into the region from the government payments for the Cherokee strip land sale. They spoke of the banks and the trains that carried the wealth of the oppressors. They did not speak of justice or morality. They spoke of survival and taking what was owed. Crawford told them his name. He told them he had shot a man at Fort Gibson. Bill Cook nodded, accepting the information as a resume. They did not care about Jake Lewis. They cared that Crawford was willing to pull the trigger. In that camp, under the canopy of the stars, Crawford Goldsby shed his given name. The transition was not official, no paper was signed, but the reality was absolute. He was now a part of the Cook gang. The days that followed were a crash course in the outlaw trade. The gang moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. They rode good horses, animals stolen from the best stock in the territory. Crawford learned the geography of the escape routes, the locations of the friendly ranchers who would trade fresh horses for a few gold coins, and the signals used to warn of approaching deputies. He learned to clean his weapon in the dark, to sleep with one ear open, and to trust no one outside the circle of the fire. Rumors reached them that Jake Lewis had not died. The bullets had wounded him severely, but the man was tough and had survived the night. The news meant little to Crawford. In his mind, he was already a killer. The intent had been there. The law would hunt him just the same for assault with intent to kill as they would for murder. The brand was on him. He felt a strange liberation in the knowledge. If he was already damned, then the specific count of his sins made no difference. The gang tested him. They watched how he handled his horse, how he stood watch, and how he reacted to sudden noises. He passed every test with a stoic calm that impressed even the hardened veterans like Jim French, another member of the outfit. Crawford possessed a natural aptitude for violence. He did not hesitate. He did not overthink. When a threat appeared, he reacted with lethal speed. By June, the gang began to plan more ambitious operations. The petty thefts of livestock were not enough to sustain the lifestyle they craved, or to satisfy the hunger for notoriety that drove Bill Cook. They looked toward the government payments, the vast sums of cash moving through the territory to pay the Cherokees for the outlet lands. It was a river of money, and they intended to drink from it. Crawford, now fully integrated into the fold, rode with them as they scouted the roads and the stations. He wore a Winchester rifle in a scabbard on his saddle now, a weapon provided by the gang's arsenal. He had traded his rough farm clothes for the attire of a desperado, a wide-brimmed hat, good boots, and a vest filled with cartridges. He looked the part, a towering figure of menace who rode with the easy grace of a Comanche and the discipline of a soldier. The psychological transformation was absolute. The boy who had been beaten in the mud was gone. In his place stood a man who viewed the world through the sights of a rifle. He had found a family that did not judge him for his parentage or his color, but valued him solely for his ability to inflict harm. The Cook gang became his tribe, and the Outlaw trail became his home. He was ready for his first true test of blood, not a personal vendetta in a dance hall, but a war against the law itself. The incident at Fort Gibson had been the spark. The coming summer would be the inferno. The transition to the outlaw life involved more than just guns and horses. It required a fundamental shift in how he viewed the people around him. In the towns they passed through, Crawford saw shopkeepers, farmers, and clerks not as neighbors, but as sheep waiting to be sheared. The teachings of Carlisle, which emphasized industry and contribution to society, were inverted. Industry was for fools. Taking was for the strong. He watched Bill Cook charm a rancher's wife into cooking them a meal, and he saw the power of fear masked as hospitality. These people helped them because they were terrified to do otherwise. Jim French took a particular interest in the new recruit. French was a volatile man, quick to laugh and quicker to shoot, and he saw a kindred spirit in Crawford. They spent long hours on the trail discussing the mechanics of robbery, how to control a room, how to identify the man most likely to resist, and how to make an example of him. Crawford absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He visualized the scenarios, playing them out in his mind until the violence became routine in his imagination before he ever committed it in reality. The gang's hideouts in the Cookson Hills were natural fortresses, mazes of limestone bluffs and dense timber where a few men could hold off a posse indefinitely. Here, Crawford learned the patience of the predator. They would wait for days, watching a road or a trail, studying the patterns of the stagecoaches and the riders. The boredom that would drive a lesser man to distraction only sharpened Crawford's focus. He sat motionless for hours, his rifle across his knees, watching the hawks circle in the hot sky, feeling a kinship with the raptors. As June approached, the heat in the territory intensified, baking the mud into hard, gray stone. The gang's resources were running low, and the itch for action was becoming undeniable. Bill Cook gathered them one evening around a small, smokeless fire deep in a ravine. He laid out the plan. They were done with petty crimes. The time had come to make a statement, to strike at the lawmen who hunted them. They would not just rob. They would war. Crawford listened, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. He did not speak, but his hand rested on the grip of his pistol. He was ready. The dance at Fort Gibson had been a clumsy brawl. What came next would be a professional slaughter. June 17, 1894, brought a suffocating heat to the Cherokee Nation, a thick, wet blanket of air that turned the timberlands along 14-Mile Creek into a steam bath. The sun hammered down on the roof of the halfway house, a way station situated on the road between Tahlequah and Muskogee, operated by a woman named Effie Crittenden. Inside the rough wooden structure, the air was stagnant, smelling of old coffee, wood smoke, and the pungent sweat of men who had been riding hard for days. The Cook gang had chosen this spot not for its comfort, but for its strategic position and the relative anonymity it offered. They were technically fugitives, but until this day their crimes had been largely confined to theft and whiskey running. That line was barely visible in the dust of the territory, but they were about to cross a chasm that no horse could jump back across. Crawford Goldsby sat in a corner of the main room, his back pressed against the rough-hewn logs, a Winchester Model 1873 rifle resting across his thighs. The weapon was a tool of precision, its lever action capable of cycling rounds with a mechanical rhythm that Crawford found soothing. He cleaned his fingernails with a small knife, his dark eyes flickering constantly to the open window where the heat shimmered off the hard-packed dirt road. Beside him, Bill Cook counted a small stack of coins, the proceeds from their latest venture, while Jim French paced the floor, his boots thumping a restless cadence that grated on the nerves of everyone in the room. Effie Crittenden moved through the kitchen with a nervous energy, clattering pots and pans louder than necessary. She knew who these men were. In the territory, names like Cook and French carried a weight that demanded hospitality, regardless of whether it was freely given. She feared them, but she feared the law just as much, for being caught harboring outlaws could lead to the confiscation of property or prison time. She kept her eyes down, serving them plates of beans and cornbread, hoping they would eat, pay, and vanish before the sun dipped below the tree line. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the buzzing of houseflies that circled the food and the occasional click of a gun hammer being tested. Crawford felt a tension coiling in his gut, a distinct sensation from the adrenaline of the dance hall shooting. That had been personal, a reaction to an insult. This waiting was professional. He was a soldier in an army of thieves now, and the enemy was everywhere. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his hand pausing near the grip of his revolver. The heat made everyone irritable, reducing their patience to a frayed thread. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats and the rattle of a wagon wheel against stone drifted up from the creek crossing. The rhythm was wrong for a casual traveler. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Bill Cook stopped counting. His hand covered the coins instantly, and he looked at French. Jim French stopped, pacing. Crawford did not move his head, but his grip tightened on the Winchester until his knuckles turned the color of parchment. The three men locked eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent communication forged in the camps and on the trails. Trouble had arrived. Sheriff Ellis Rattling Gord rode at the head of a 7-man posse, a mix of deputies and armed citizens intent on serving warrants for the larceny charges accumulating against the Cook brothers. Among them rode Deputy Sequoia Houston, a man known for his tracking ability and his lack of fear. They approached the halfway house with weapons drawn, the metal glinting in the harsh sunlight. They had received a tip, a whisper in Talqua that the gang was hole up at Crittenden's. They did not expect a surrender, but they underestimated the ferocity of the response they were about to provoke. Crawford slid from his chair to the floor, moving with the fluid grace of a cat. He crawled to the window, peering over the sill. He saw the badges, he saw the shotguns and the rifles. There was no hesitation in his mind, no calculation of the odds. The training at Carlisle, the discipline of the drill field, and the rage of the outcast fused into a singular purpose. He levered around into the chamber of the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack was the only warning the room received. "Law," Crawford said, the word flat and devoid of emotion. Bill Cook kicked the table over, creating a makeshift barricade. Jim French smashed the glass of the side window with the barrel of his pistol. The sudden violence of their movement sent Effie Crittenden screaming into the back room, diving for cover as the world exploded. Sheriff Rattling Gorge shouted for the occupants to come out with their hands raised. The demand hung in the humid air for a heartbeat, a relic of a civilized procedure that held no currency here. The answer came from the barrel of Crawford's rifle. He leveled the sights on the lead riders, exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding, and pulled the trigger. The glass of the front window shattered outward, mingling with the smoke and the thunder of the black powder. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near the sheriff's horse, causing the animal to rear and scream. The posse scrambled, diving from their saddles, seeking cover behind the wagon and the large oak trees that lined the front of the property. The return fire was instantaneous. A hail of lead slammed into the halfway house, splintering the wood, punching holes through the thin walls and filling the interior with a storm of debris. Crawford worked the lever of his rifle. Clack, bang, clack, bang. He fired with a rhythmic intensity, sweeping the yard. He was not firing to suppress, he was firing to kill. He saw movement behind the wagon, a hat, a shoulder, a flash of a rifle barrel. He aimed at the shapes, his mind narrowing down to the front sight post. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that blotted out all thought. Dust and smoke filled the room, stinging his eyes and coating his throat with grit. Deputy Sequoia Houston, bold and perhaps foolish in the heat of the moment, stepped out from behind the cover of a tree to get a clear shot at the window where the muzzle flashes were brightest. He raised his rifle, seeking a target in the gloom of the cabin's interior. It was a fatal error. Crawford saw the movement. He shifted his aim, tracking the deputy's torso. The distance was short, less than 50 yards. Crawford squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Sequoia Houston in the chest, punching through ribs and lung. The impact lifted the deputy off his feet and threw him backward into the dirt. He landed hard, his rifle flying from his hands. He did not rise. The blood began to pool beneath him, turning the dust to a dark crimson mud. A shout went up from the posse, a cry of rage and dismay at the fall of their comrade. "Got one!" Crawford yelled, his voice cracking with the strain. The confirmation of the kill sent a surge of dark electricity through him. He had killed a lawman. He had crossed the final line. There was no going back to the farm, no going back to the dance halls. He was a capital offender now, a man marked for death by every court in the land. Bill Cook and Jim French kept up a withering fire from the flanks, pinning the remaining deputies down. The outlaws knew they could not hold the house forever. The posse would eventually flank them or set fire to the structure. They needed to move. "To the horses!" Cook roared over the din of the gunfire. The gang exited through the back door, moving low and fast. Their horses were tied in a thicket of brush 50 yards behind the house, nervous and pulling at their reins as the gunfire cracked like whips around them. Crawford turned as he ran, firing from the hip back toward the front of the house to keep the deputies' heads down. He reached his mount, a tall bay gelding with a white blaze, and vaulted into the saddle. The posse, realizing the outlaws were fleeing, broke cover and rushed the house, firing at the retreating figures. Bullets zipped through the leaves around them, snapping twigs and thudding into the tree trunks. One round grazed the flank of French's horse, causing it to buck wildly, but French held on, spurring the animal into a gallop. Crawford wheeled his horse around, taking one last look at the carnage he had left behind. He saw the body of Sequoia Houston lying still in the yard, a crumpled heap of blue and red. He felt a sneer curl his lip. They had come for a thief. They had found a killer. The gang tore through the underbrush, riding with a reckless disregard for the terrain. They crashed through creek beds and scrambled up shale banks, putting distance between themselves and the scene of the slaughter. They did not slow down until they were miles deep into the Cookson Hills, in a rocky ravine where the tracks would be impossible to follow. The horses were blown, their sides heaving with exertion, their coats slick with foamy sweat. The men dismounted, silence returning to them. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of men who had shared a blood pact. Bill Cook looked at Crawford. He saw the change in the young man's face. The uncertainty was gone. The boy who had joined them in the spring was vanished. Standing there, wiping the powder residue from his face, was a man who had looked at the authority of the United States government and answered it with a bullet. "You got Houston," Jim French said, his voice holding a mixture of awe and fear. "You dropped him cold." Crawford nodded, reloading his Winchester, sliding the fresh cartridges into the loading gate with methodical precision. "He stepped out," Crawford said simply. "He shouldn't have stepped out." The news of the shootout at 14 Mile Creek spread across the territory with the speed of a prairie fire. The telegraph lines hummed with the report, "Deputy Marshal killed, Cook gang responsible," and a new name began to circulate, a moniker that would soon be printed in every newspaper from Fort Smith to Wichita. The survivors of the posse, when asked to describe the shooter who had killed Houston, spoke of the young mixed blood with the dark face and the deadly aim. Someone, perhaps a reporter seeking a sensational hook or a deputy trying to categorize the new threat, attached a name to the description. They called him Cherokee Bill. Crawford heard the name a few days later from a sympathizer who brought them supplies. He rolled the words around in his mind. Cherokee Bill. It sounded like a dime novel character, a title of infamy. He accepted it. Crawford Goldsby was the name of a Buffalo soldier's abandoned son, a name of shame and confusion. Cherokee Bill was the name of a man who killed deputies. It was a name that commanded fear. He adopted the persona as he would a new coat, wrapping himself in the legend before the ink was even dry on the wanted posters. The gang moved deeper into the hills, utilizing the network of caves and canyons that made the region a nightmare for law enforcement. They knew the respite would be short. The killing of a federal officer brought the full weight of Judge Isaac Parker's court down upon them. The hanging judge would not tolerate the murder of his servants. More marshals would come, more pauses would be formed, the price on their heads would skyrocket. For Crawford, the reality of his situation crystallized in the nights that followed. He lay under the stars, listening to the night sounds of the forest, and realized he was dead already. The rope was being woven for him. The lumber for his scaffold was growing in the forest. The inevitability of his end liberated him from all restraint. If he was to die, he would not die alone. He would take as many of them with him as he could. He felt a cold, hard hatred for the society that had rejected him, for the father who had left him, and for the laws that sought to cage him. He began to modify his equipment. He filed the sights of his revolver to prevent snagging. He practiced his draw until his hand moved faster than the eye could follow. He became obsessed with the mechanics of killing. He discussed angles and bullet penetration with the older outlaws, learning the trade of the gunman with the dedication of a scholar. The slaughter at 14 Mile Creek was not an accident or a panicked reaction. It was his graduation ceremony. The heat of June continued to bake the land, but Crawford felt cold inside. The image of Sequoia Houston falling backward played in his mind on a loop, not as a nightmare, but as a study tape. He analyzed the shot. He had aimed center mass. It was a good shot. Next time he would be faster. Next time he would not miss the first volley. The gang needed money. The few dollars they had were gone, spent on ammunition and food. The killing had made them famous, but it hadn't made them rich. Bill Cook, sensing the mood of his men, began to plan their next move. They needed a target that would pay for the risk they were now taking every time they showed their faces. They looked at the maps. They looked at the towns. Crawford sat cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in his nostrils. He looked up at Cook. "Where next?" he asked. The question was not a request for permission. It was a demand for action. He needed the noise again. He needed the chaos. The silence of the hills allowed the ghosts to creep too close. "Lincoln County," Cook said, pointing to a spot on the map. "The bank in Chandler." Crawford smiled, an expression that did not reach his eyes. A bank. That meant money. That meant townspeople. That meant lawmen. It meant war. He snapped the lever of his Winchester closed. "Let's ride," he said. The slaughter at 14 Mile Creek had served its purpose. It had stripped away the last vestiges of Crawford Goldsby's humanity and revealed the monster beneath. The Buffalo Soldier's son was gone. Cherokee Bill had arrived, and he was hungry for more blood. The road to the gallows was open, and he intended to gallop down it at full speed, leaving a trail of bodies as mile markers. July 31st, 1894, fell upon the Oklahoma Territory with the weight of a blacksmith's hammer. The sun, a white-hot disk in a cloudless sky, scorched the red earth until it cracked and turned to powder. In the town of Chandler, the county seat of Lincoln County, the midday heat had driven the inhabitants indoors. The streets, churned into deep ruts by freight wagons and buggies, lay empty and silent, shimmering under the oppressive thermal waves. Dogs sought refuge under boardwalks, panting in the dust, while the town's merchants sat in the dim recesses of their stores waiting for the sun to lower and the customers to return. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of cicadas and the occasional stamping of a horse hitched to a rail. To the west of town, a column of dust marked the approach of 7 riders. They moved at a steady trot, their horses coated in a layer of sweat and grime that spoke of hard travel. The men in the saddles wore long linen dusters, despite the stifling temperature, garments chosen not for fashion but to conceal the heavy arsenals strapped to their bodies. Neckerchiefs covered their faces, pulled up to the bridge of their noses, filtering the dust and masking their identities. At the head of the formation rode Bill Cook, his eyes narrowed against the glare, scanning the horizon for any sign of a patrol. Flanking him was Cherokee Bill, sitting tall on a black gelding, his Winchester rifle resting across the pommel of his saddle, his finger tracing the trigger guard. They did not ride with the urgency of fleeing men, but with the deliberate pace of predators entering a grazing herd. They had spent weeks in the scrub timber, living off the land and the charity of frightened homesteaders, planning this strike with cold calculation. The Lincoln County Bank sat in the center of Chandler, a symbol of the creeping civilization that the outlaws despised and preyed upon. It held the cash of the merchants, the savings of the farmers, and most importantly, to the Cook gang, the payrolls and hard currency that kept the territory functioning. The gang reached the outskirts of Chandler without raising an alarm. The lethargy of the afternoon worked in their favor. They rode down the main thoroughfare, the sound of 28 hooves muffled by the thick layer of dust. Cherokee Bill looked left and right, his dark eyes taking in the details of the street, the location of the hardware store, the sheriff's office, the alleys that offered escape routes. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. the surge of adrenaline that sharpened his vision and slowed the passage of time. The heat seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. They halted in front of the bank, a brick building that projected an image of stability in a town of wood and canvas. The men dismounted in a practiced sequence. 4 of them, including Cook and Cherokee Bill, moved toward the entrance, while the remaining 3 stayed with the horses, their rifles unlimbered, eyes scanning the rooftops and windows for any sign of resistance. The street remained empty. The town slept on, unaware that the wolf was already inside the fold. Cherokee Bill pushed through the double doors of the bank, the bell above the frame announcing their arrival with a cheerful chime that clashed with the menace of their presence. The interior was cooler than the street, smelling of ink, ledger paper, and floor wax. 2 clerks stood behind the polished wooden counter, their conversation dying in their throats as they looked up into the bores of the intruders' weapons. A customer, an elderly farmer counting out coins for a deposit, froze, his hands trembling as he realized the situation. "Hands high," Bill Cook ordered, his voice flat and authoritative. "Move away from the counter." The clerks complied instantly, backing away until they hit the wall. The farmer raised his weathered hands, his eyes wide with terror. Cherokee Bill vaulted over the counter, his boots landing heavily on the floorboards. He moved with a terrifying efficiency, sweeping the cash drawers onto the floor and stuffing the currency into a canvas grain sack. He ignored the silver. It was too heavy and slowed a man down. He wanted the paper, the greenbacks, and the banknotes. "Open the vault," Cherokee Bill commanded, jamming the barrel of his Winchester into the ribs of the nearest clerk. The man, a young fellow with spectacles, shook his head violently, sweat beading on his upper lip. "It's on a timer," the clerk stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't open it. No one can until 4 o'clock. Cherokee Bill looked at the heavy steel door of the safe. He knew the mechanism. It was a common security measure, and he had no dynamite to force the issue. A flash of irritation crossed his face, but he did not waste time arguing. He turned back to the drawers and the counter, scooping up every loose bill he could find. The take was smaller than they had hoped, perhaps only a few $100s, but it was money they did not have to work for. Outside, the silence of the street shattered. J.B. Mitchell, the town barber, had been looking out the window of his shop across the street. He was a man of routine, taking a break between shaves to watch the dust settle. He had seen the men dismount. He had seen the rifles. The realization hit him a moment too late, but when it did, he acted with a civic courage that outweighed his caution. He ran out of his shop, stepping onto the boardwalk, and filled his lungs. "Robbery!" Mitchell screamed, his voice echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. "The bank is being robbed! Get your guns!" The shout acted as a catalyst. The sleepy town woke up instantly. Men in the general store dropped their goods and scrambled for weapons. The sheriff's deputy, eating lunch in the saloon, knocked over his chair and drew his revolver. Inside the bank, the gang heard the alarm. "Time's up," Bill Cook said. He signaled the retreat. They backed out of the door, shielding themselves with the hostages for a moment before shoving them aside and bursting onto the sidewalk. The sun was blinding after the dimness of the bank. Cherokee Bill stepped out, the sack of money in his left hand, his rifle in his right. He scanned the street instantly. He saw the movement on the boardwalk across the way. J.B. Mitchell was still there, shouting, pointing at the bank, trying to rally the town. The barber was unarmed, clad in his white smock, a figure of righteous indignation standing in the open. Most men in the gang's position would have focused on mounting their horses and riding for the tree line. They would have fired into the air to keep heads down. But Cherokee Bill was not most men. He stopped. He planted his feet in the dust, creating a stable firing platform. He looked at Mitchell. The distance was significant, over 150 yards. The barber was a small figure against the backdrop of the dry goods store. Cherokee Bill raised the Winchester. He did not rush the motion. He brought the stock to his cheek, his eye finding the sights. The world narrowed down to the notch of the rear sight and the post of the front sight, with the white smock of the barber centered in the picture. He did not know J.B. Mitchell. He had no quarrel with the man. But Mitchell was making noise. Mitchell was raising an alarm. Mitchell was a nuisance. He exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The sharp crack of the gunshot cut through the confusion of the street. The bullet, a .44-40 slug, bridged the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck J.B. Mitchell squarely in the head. The barber's shout was cut off as if a switch had been thrown. He crumpled to the boardwalk, a lifeless heap of white cloth stained with sudden red. "Got him," Bill said, lowering the rifle. His voice was conversational, devoid of triumph or regret. It was a statement of fact, like noting the weather. The brutality of the shot froze the town for a split second. The citizens of Chandler had seen violence before, but this was something different. This was not a gunfight. It was an execution performed with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. The fear that rippled through the onlookers was primal. They realized they were not dealing with ordinary thieves. "Ride!" Bill Cook yelled, swinging into his saddle. The gang mounted up, their horses skittish from the gunshot and the sudden commotion. Cherokee Bill tied the sack to his saddle horn and swung onto the black gelding. He racked the lever of his Winchester, chambering a fresh round, and looked back at the body of the barber. He felt nothing. The man had stuck his head out. The man had paid the price. It was the law of the wild, the only law Bill acknowledged. Bullets began to fly from the windows and doorways of the town as the citizens recovered their wits. Puffs of smoke bloomed from the hardware store and the saloon. Lead whistled past the outlaws, kicking up spurts of dust around the horses' hooves. One round struck a water trough, sending a spray of liquid into the air. The gang returned fire, shooting wildly to suppress the pursuit. Cherokee Bill turned in his saddle, firing one-handed, sending rounds smashing into store windows and splintering the wooden awnings. They galloped out of Chandler, heading south toward the Deep Fork River. The horses stretched out, their hooves hammering the earth in a frantic rhythm. The wind tore at their dusters, making them snap like flags. Behind them, the bells of the town began to ring, a mournful clamor that signaled disaster. The chase was on, but the gang had the advantage of the head start and superior mounts. They rode hard for 10 miles, pushing the animals to the limit of their endurance. The terrain changed as they approached the river bottoms, the open prairie giving way to dense thickets of blackjack oak and tangled undergrowth. They plunged into the timber, the branches whipping at their faces and clothes. They slowed only when they reached a secluded clearing deep within the bottoms, a spot known only to the outlaws and the deer. The horses stood with their heads low, their sides heaving, foam dripping from their bits. The men dismounted, their faces caked in a mask of sweat and red dust. They checked their weapons first, reloading the spent chambers before turning their attention to the loot. Bill Cook dumped the contents of the sack onto a flat rock. The pile of crumpled bills looked pathetic against the magnitude of the violence they had just unleashed. They counted it quickly. It amounted to less than $500. Divided 7 ways, it was barely enough to keep them in whiskey and ammunition for a month. "A lot of noise for a little corn," Jim French muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. He looked at Cherokee Bill. "You drilled that barber clean. Was he armed?" "He had a mouth," Bill replied, wiping the dust from his rifle with a rag. "That's dangerous enough." The other men looked at Bill. Even among this group of hard cases, murderers and thieves, the shooting of J.B. Mitchell sat heavily. It wasn't the morality of the act that disturbed them. It was the utter lack of necessity. Mitchell posed no physical threat at that range. He was just a man yelling. To kill him was to declare war on the entire population, to show that no life held value. It escalated their status from robbers to monsters. Bill Cook watched his recruit closely. He saw the blankness in Cherokee Bill's eyes. There was no shaking, no post-adrenaline crash, no remorse. The young man sat on a log, methodically cleaning the dust from the receiver of his Winchester, as calm as if he were sitting on his mother's porch. Cook realized then that he was no longer leading this boy. He had unleashed something he could not control. Cherokee Bill was not fighting for money or survival. He was killing because it was his nature. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows through the trees. The heat did not break. The air remained heavy and still, pressing down on the fugitives. They made a cold camp, fearing that a fire would give away their position. They ate dried beef and drank tepid water from their canteens. As the light faded, the reality of the day settled in. They had robbed a bank in the county seat. They had killed a citizen in broad daylight. The telegraph wires were undoubtedly singing with the news. Every marshal in the territory would be saddling up. The reward money would increase. The noose was tightening. Cherokee Bill lay back against his saddle, looking up at the patches of sky visible through the canopy. He replayed the moment of the shot in his mind. He saw the white smock. He saw the sight picture. He felt the recoil. It was a perfect shot, a difficult shot. He felt a flicker of pride in the technical proficiency of it. The fact that J.B. Mitchell had a family, a life, or a history did not enter the equation. Mitchell was a target that had presented itself, and Bill had engaged it. The gang slept in shifts, one man always awake, listening for the snap of a twig or the jingle of a spur. The deep fork bottoms were alive with the sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of an armadillo in the leaves. To the men of the Cook gang, every sound was a potential threat. They were hunted men living on borrowed time. For Cherokee Bill, the darkness held no terror. He was the terror. The killing of the barber had severed the last thin thread connecting him to the civilized world. He had shown the people of the territory that he could reach out and take a life from 200 yards away simply because he felt like it. The fear this generated was a weapon more powerful than his Winchester. It made people freeze. It made them look away. It made him powerful. In Chandler, the undertaker was preparing the body of J.B. Mitchell. The town was in shock, the citizens gathering in small groups to discuss the atrocity. They spoke of the outlaw with the dark face and the long coat. They spoke of the impossible shot. The name Cherokee Bill was whispered with a new reverence, a reverence born of absolute dread. He was no longer just a bandit. He was a scourge, a force of nature that struck without warning and without mercy. The night deepened. The outlaws rested, gathering their strength for the running fight that would become their existence. Cherokee Bill closed his eyes, his hand resting on the cold steel of his rifle. He slept the dreamless sleep of the conscience-free, ready to rise with the sun and bring more death to the Oklahoma territory. The blood money from Chandler was in his pocket, but the true currency he had earned that day was a reputation that would outlive him, written in the red dust of the street and the blood of a barber who had dared to raise his voice. September 1894 arrived in the Cherokee Nation with a deceptive gentleness. The searing heat of the summer beginning to yield to the crisp edges of autumn. The leaves of the blackjack oaks were just starting to turn the color of dried tobacco, and the evenings carried a chill that required a coat. For the Cook gang, however, the cooling weather brought no relief. The pressure from the federal authorities had become a physical weight, a crushing force that drove them into tighter and tighter circles. The fame they had accrued at 14 Mile Creek and Chandler had curdled into a dangerous infamy. They were no longer merely thieves, They were hunted animals, tracked by men who carried the authority of the rope and the gun. Crawford Goldsby, now universally known as Cherokee Bill, separated from the main body of the gang near the Verdigris River. The constant proximity of the other men, the smell of their sweat, and the ceaseless tension of the camp had begun to grate on his nerves. He needed money, and he needed a change of scenery, however brief. He turned his horse toward the vicinity of Noata, riding through the back trails and the dense timber to avoid the patrols that watched the main roads. His destination was not a hideout or a cave, but the home of his own flesh and blood. He rode toward the farm of Mose Brown, the man who had married his sister, Georgia. It was a domestic setting, a place of pigs, chickens, and the mundane struggles of subsistence farming, a world Crawford had rejected but now sought to exploit. He did not go there for comfort or for the warmth of family connection. He went there because he believed he was owed. There was a debt between the two men, a trivial sum involving the sale of livestock, specifically hogs, that had remained unpaid. To a man living on the run, where a single cartridge cost money and a fresh horse cost gold, every debt was significant. He arrived at the Brown homestead in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the yard. The dogs barked, a ragged chorus that brought Georgia to the door. She wiped her hands on her apron, her face registering a complex mixture of relief and terror. She saw her brother, the boy she had grown up with, but she also saw Cherokee Bill, the killer whose face adorned the wanted posters tacked to the walls of every marshal's office in the territory. She knew that his presence was a danger, a lightning rod that could draw the fire of the law down upon her home. Crawford dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth of the yard. He tied his horse to the fence rail, checking the cinch and the rifle scabbard from habit. He did not embrace his sister. He nodded to her, a curt acknowledgement of their bond, and looked past her toward the barn. Mose Brown was there, working with the livestock, feeding the pigs that were the source of their current dispute. Mose was a hard-working man trying to build a life in a hard land. He was not an outlaw, but he was not a man easily cowed. He had married into the Goldsby family, and he knew the volatility that ran in Crawford's blood. The two men met in the space between the house and the barn. The air smelled of dust, manure, and the wood smoke drifting from the kitchen chimney. It was a scene of pastoral normalcy, shattered by the presence of the dark figure in the dusty coat. Mose wiped his brow with his sleeve, leaning on his pitchfork. He did not offer his hand. He looked at Crawford with a wariness that bordered on hostility. He knew why the outlaw was there. "You shouldn't be here, Crawford," Mose said, his voice low. "The marshals have been asking questions. They know you got kin in these parts." "I ain't here for the marshals," Crawford replied, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "I'm here for my money. You sold them hogs. I want my share." The dispute was petty. It involved a sum of money that would not have bought a good saddle. Yet in Crawford's mind, it was a matter of principle and dominance. He was the most feared man in the territory. He had killed deputies and terrorized towns. To be stiffed by a farmer, even a brother-in-law, was an insult he could not abide. It suggested that Mose did not respect the reputation Crawford had built in blood. Mose shook his head, frustration etching lines into his face. "I don't have it, Crawford. The price was low. We needed flour and seed. You think money grows on these trees? I got a family to feed, your sister to feed." "That ain't my concern," Crawford said. He stepped closer, invading Mose's personal space. The threat was implicit in his posture, in the way his hand drifted to his waist. "You owe me. I want it now." The argument escalated quickly, fueled by the stress of the fugitive life and the stubborn pride of the farmer. Voices raised, cutting through the quiet of the farm. Georgia stood on the porch, twisting her apron in her hands, watching the two men she loved circle each other like wolves. She called out to them, begging them to stop, but her voice was a whisper against the gale of their anger. Mose Brown made a fatal miscalculation. He relied on the bond of marriage and blood to protect him. He believed that Crawford, for all his violence against the world, would not turn his weapon on his own family. He assumed there was a line the outlaw would not cross. He threw the pitchfork down, the metal tines clanging against a stone. "I ain't giving you nothing today," Mose declared, turning his back on Crawford to walk toward the house. "Go back to the hills. Leave us be." To turn one's back on Cherokee Bill was an act of dismissal. It was a signal that the conversation was over, that Mose had the final word. Crawford stared at the retreating figure of his brother-in-law. The rejection triggered a cold, black rage in his gut. It was the same rage that had killed Jake Lewis, the same rage that had dropped the barber in Chandler. It was the fury of a man who demanded absolute submission from the world around him. Crawford drew his revolver. The motion was a blur of motion, practiced and perfect. He did not hesitate. He did not think of his sister watching from the porch. He did not think of the nieces and nephews who called Mose father. He saw only an obstacle, a man who had defied him. "Turn around," Crawford said, his voice barely audible. Mose stopped. He turned slowly, perhaps sensing the shift in the air, the sudden terrifying silence that falls before the thunder. He saw the gun in Crawford's hand. His eyes widened, not with fear but with disbelief. "Crawford," he said, the name a question. Crawford pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked the afternoon air, a sharp, ugly sound that sent the chickens scattering in a panic of feathers and dust. The bullet struck Mose Brown in the chest. The impact staggered him. He took a step back, his hand going to the wound, his mouth opening in a silent gasp. He looked at Crawford, the disbelief freezing on his face as the life began to drain out of him. Crawford cocked the hammer and fired again. The second shot hit Mose in the stomach, doubling him over. He fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the dirt of the yard he had worked so hard to maintain. The blood began to spread, dark and rich, turning the dust to mud. Georgia screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that tore from her throat and echoed across the fields. She ran from the porch, stumbling down the steps, rushing toward the fallen man. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands fluttering over his body, trying to staunch the flow of blood that pulsed from his chest. She looked up at her brother, her eyes filled with a hatred and sorrow that defied language. "You killed him!" she shrieked. "You killed him, your own kin!" Crawford stood over them, the smoking pistol still in his hand. He looked down at the body of Mose Brown, then at his sister. His face was a mask of stone. There was no regret in his eyes, no flicker of guilt. The debt was settled. The defiance was punished. The logic of his actions was perfectly clear to him, even if it was insanity to the rest of the world. "He shouldn't have withheld what was mine," Crawford said. He holstered the gun with a smooth, deliberate motion. He walked past his weeping sister and the dying man. He went to the house, entering the kitchen with the familiarity of a ghost. He looked for money, for food, for anything of value that he could take. He found a few dollars in a jar, the meager savings Mose had tried to protect. He took it. He took a piece of cold cornbread from the table. He walked back out into the yard. Mose Brown was dead. The silence had returned to the farm, broken only by George's sobbing. Crawford untied his horse. He checked the cinch again. He mounted up, looking down from the height of the saddle. The scene below him was a tableau of tragedy, the widow, the corpse, the blood. It was a scene he had created, a masterpiece of his own. Destruction. "Tell the marshals I was here," Crawford said to his sister. "Tell them Cherokee Bill collects his debts." He turned the horse and rode out of the yard, not looking back. He rode back toward the timber, back toward the darkness of the creek bottoms. The killing of Mose Brown marked a significant descent in his psychological trajectory. Until this moment, his violence had been directed outward, at the society that rejected him and the lawmen who hunted him. Now the violence had turned inward. He was devouring his own. He had severed the roots that connected him to humanity. A man who would kill his brother-in-law over a few hogs was a man capable of anything. The news of the murder spread through the territory with a grim speed. It horrified even those who had secretly admired the Outlaws' rebellion against the federal government. To kill a deputy was one thing. To kill family was a violation of the oldest laws of mankind. The community recoiled. The safe houses that might have opened for him began to close. The people looked at him now not as a romantic figure of resistance, but as a rabid dog that needed to be put down. Crawford felt the shift in the atmosphere. He knew that he had crossed a bridge and burned it behind him. He was truly alone now. The gang was his only refuge, and even they looked at him with a new wariness when he rejoined them. They heard the story. They saw the coldness in his demeanor. They realized that their lives were held in the hands of a man who recognized no loyalty greater than his own immediate impulse. He spent the nights following the murder in a state of heightened vigilance. He did not dream of Mose Brown. He did not see his sister's face in the firelight. He saw only the road ahead, a road that was narrowing with every mile. He cleaned his guns obsessively. He practiced his draw until his hand was a blur. He was preparing for the end, stripping away every weakness, every emotional attachment, until nothing remained but the killer. The murder of Mose Brown demonstrated the terrifying senselessness of Cherokee Bill's violence. It was not calculated for gain. The money involved was negligible. It was not for survival. Mose posed no physical threat. It was an act of pure ego, a demonstration of power for power's sake. It proved that no one was safe, not the innocent, not the guilty, and not the blood kin. In the weeks that followed, the autumn deepened. The wind stripped the leaves from the trees, leaving the branches bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Crawford rode through this dying landscape, a harbinger of death himself. He had become the monster the newspapers claimed he was. He had validated every fear, every warning. He had looked into the face of his family and pulled the trigger. The marshals redoubled their efforts. The killing of a civilian, especially a relative, added a layer of urgency to the hunt. They knew that a man who would do this was unraveling. He was dangerous and unpredictable. They tracked him with a renewed intensity, pressing into the Cookson Hills, questioning the residents, squeezing the support network. Crawford moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. He ate in the saddle. He slept with his back to a rock and his rifle across his chest. He was hunting and being hunted, caught in a cycle of violence that could only end in blood. The incident at the Brown farm was not just a crime, it was a declaration. It stated that Crawford Goldsby was dead and only Cherokee Bill remained, a creature of impulse and gunpowder, devoid of conscience, devoid of heart, and terrified of nothing but the silence of his own thoughts. The landscape of the Cherokee Nation, once his home, had become his prison. Every farmhouse looked like a trap. Every face looked like an informant. The world was shrinking down to the size of a gun sight, and in the center of that sight, Crawford stood alone, waiting for the inevitable collision with the forces he had provoked. The killing of Mose Brown was the point of no return. He had cast off his humanity in the dust of that farmyard, leaving it to bleed out alongside his brother-in-law. Now there was only the ride, the gun, and the long dark fall into history. The 20th day of October, 1894, brought a moonless darkness to the stretch of track near Coretta, a solitary water stop on the Iron Mountain and Southern Railroad line. The steel rails hummed with a low-frequency vibration, carrying the message of the approaching southbound express train long before the cyclopean beam of its headlight cut through the gloom of the Cherokee Nation. Hidden in the dense scrub oak and tangled briars flanking the right-of-way, Crawford Goldsby, now fully inhabiting the persona of Cherokee Bill, crouched alongside Bill Cook and two other hardened members of the gang. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying vegetation, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of the rails themselves. They were done with the small-time raids on country stores and the high-risk, low-reward assaults on brick-and-mortar banks. They had turned their sights on the arteries of commerce that pumped life and federal coin into the territory, targeting the iron horses that symbolized the inevitable intrusion of the white world into their shrinking sanctuary. The plan was crude, brutal, and effective. They did not pile logs on the track or use dynamite to derail the engine, risking the destruction of the prize they sought in a tangled wreck of steel and steam. Instead, they relied on a misplaced switch, a manipulation of the mechanical veins of the line that would divert the massive locomotive onto a siding, forcing it to a grinding halt or wrecking it in the soft earth of the spur. Crawford watched the signal light, his Winchester Model 1873 resting heavily on his knee, the walnut stock cool against his cheek. He felt a different kind of anticipation than he had felt in the brush at 14 Mile Creek or on the sun-baked street in Chandler. This was industrial warfare. This was pitting flesh, blood, and lead against the crushing power of steam and steel. The train appeared first as a distant rumble, then as a blinding light sweeping the trees, illuminating the mist rising from the low ground like ghostly fingers. The noise grew from a rhythmic clatter to a deafening roar, the chugging of the pistons and the squeal of the wheels filling the night with a mechanical scream. The engineer, spotting the open switch at the last possible second, slammed the reversing lever and engaged the air brakes. The screech of metal on metal was a physical assault on the ears, a shriek that tore through the quiet of the countryside. Sparks showered from the locked wheels in cascades of angry orange fire as the massive engine shuddered, slid, and finally groaned to a violent halt just short of the derailment point, the boiler hissing like a wounded dragon. Before the wheels had stopped turning, the gang broke from the cover of the trees. They moved like wraiths in the steam that vented from the relief valves, enveloping the train in a man-made fog. Crawford scrambled up the loose gravel of the embankment, his boots finding purchase on the shifting stone. He leaped onto the platform between the coal tender and the express car, the heat from the boiler radiating against his face, singing his eyebrows. He fired 2 shots into the air, the reports cracking sharply over the hissing steam, a declaration of intent that needed no translation. "Open up!" he roared, hammering the brass butt plate of his rifle against the heavy sliding door of the express car. "Open up or we blow it to hell!" Inside the car, the express messenger, a man paid a meager wage to guard the company's strongbox with his life, hesitated. He heard the voices, the shots, and the undeniable reality of the holdup. He knew the stories circulating in the depots and rail yards. He knew who was out there. The reputation of the Cook gang had traveled up and down the line, whispered by brakemen and conductors. To resist was suicide. The heavy door slid back on its iron rollers with a rumble, revealing the messenger standing with his hands raised, his face pale and sweating in the yellow lantern light. Crawford vaulted into the car, his eyes sweeping the interior instantly. He ignored the messenger, pushing past him to the safe. It was a through safe, a heavy iron box locked and timed, accessible only at the terminus. A wave of frustration washed over him, hot and prickly. He turned his attention to the local box, smashing the lock with the heel of his boot and a well-placed shot from his revolver. The mechanism shattered. He scooped out the contents, packages of currency, heavy canvas sacks of silver coins and registered mail pouches. It was a chaotic harvest, grabbing blindly at whatever looked valuable, stuffing it into the grain sacks they had brought for the purpose. "Get out," Crawford ordered the messenger, shoving him toward the open door with the barrel of his rifle. "Get down on the ground and don't lift your head." The gang moved down the length of the train, boarding the passenger coaches with the precision of a military unit. The scene inside the first coach was one of frozen terror. Men in suits sat rigid in the plush velvet seats, clutching their hats, their eyes wide and fixed on the intruders. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths to stifle their sobs, their faces drained of color. The air in the car smelled of stale tobacco smoke, coal dust, hair tonic, and the sour reek of fear. Crawford walked down the narrow aisle, his spurs jingling on the carpet runner, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He held his revolver in his right hand, the hammer cocked, the dark bore sweeping across the rows of passengers. "Wallets out," he commanded, his voice low and menacing, vibrating with the authority of the gun. "Watches, jewelry, put it in the hat. Make it quick and you live. Hesitate and you don't." He moved from seat to seat, a grim collector of tolls. He looked into the faces of the passengers, lawyers, merchants, settlers, and saw the absolute power he held over them. A fat man in a checkered vest fumbled with a gold watch chain, his fingers trembling so violently he could not work the clasp. Crawford reached out, grabbed the chain, and jerked it free, ripping the vest pocket and sending a button popping across the aisle. He did not speak. He simply stared at the man until the passenger looked away, unable to meet the outlaw's dead, shark-like gaze. They worked the train for 20 minutes, stripping the passengers of their valuables with methodical efficiency. The haul was significant: gold watches, diamond rings, rolls of greenbacks. But for Crawford, the true currency was the dominance. He controlled the environment completely. The conductor, the brakeman, the passengers, they were all puppets dancing on his strings. When the whistle of the gang's lookout signaled that it was time to leave, Crawford backed out of the car, firing a final shot through the roof that sent splinters and dust raining down on the screaming passengers. A final reminder of their helplessness. They vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the train disabled and the passengers traumatized. They rode hard away from the tracks, putting miles of timber between them and the inevitable telegraph messages. They divided the loot in a dry creek bed miles away, the coins clinking softly in the darkness. The robbery at Coretta was a success, proving that they could strike the railroads with impunity. It emboldened them. The fear they inspired was a shield, a force field that seemed to protect them from the consequences of their actions. But the money, when counted, was never enough. The lifestyle of the fugitive was expensive, requiring bribes, fresh horses, and high prices for supplies acquired in secret. 64 days later, on December 23, 1894, the gang struck again, driven by the depletion of their funds and the addiction to the adrenaline of the raid. The target this time was the Missouri Pacific Depot and train at Noata, a town Crawford knew well from his drifting days. The familiarity bred a dangerous contempt. They did not bother with the cover of deep night or a secluded stretch of track. They rode into town in the early evening, the sun just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. They secured the depot while the station agent, a man named Richard Richards, was busy with the telegraph key, cutting the line to prevent an alarm. The northbound train pulled into the station on schedule, the engineer unaware that the platform was held by the most wanted men in the territory. As the train hissed to a halt, the brakes squealing, the gang emerged from the shadows of the depot like a pack of wolves springing a trap. This time, the violence was immediate and escalated. They fired a volley into the side of the engine cab, shattering the glass gauges and forcing the engineer and fireman to dive for the steel floor of the cabin, covering their heads as glass and lead rained around them. Crawford led the assault on the passenger cars, his blood up, his patience gone. He kicked open the door of the smoker, the air inside thick with a blue haze of cigar smoke. The men inside looked up, startled by the intrusion, their conversations dying instantly. Crawford stepped into the light of the oil lamps, his face uncovered, his identity unmistakable to anyone who had seen the wanted posters. Cherokee Bill, a passenger whispered, the name rippling through the car like a contagion passing from lip to lip. "That's right," Crawford announced, striding down the aisle, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "And I want everything you got. Dig deep, or die here." The robbery at Noata was more aggressive, more brutal than Coretta. The gang was tired, fraying at the edges, and the constant pressure of the hunt had stripped away their veneer of professionalism. A passenger who hesitated to hand over a ring was struck across the face with a pistol barrel, the sound of steel on bone sickeningly loud in the confined space. Blood sprayed onto the window glass, bright red against the black night outside. Crawford watched the assault without blinking. He felt no sympathy. The passengers were cattle, existing only to be slaughtered or shorn. They were the soft citizens of a world that wanted him dead. He moved to the express car where the agent had barricaded himself inside, piling crates against the door. Crawford fired through the wood, the heavy .45 caliber slugs punching through the planks to splinter the crates inside. "Open it or burn!" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. The threat of fire was the ultimate weapon on a wooden train. It meant death for everyone on board. The barricade was dismantled and the door slid open. The agent stood trembling, his hands in the air. The take was meager again in the express car, forcing them to rely on the passengers for the bulk of the loot. As they worked the train, stripping the terrified travelers of wedding bands and pocket money, the town of Noata began to wake up to the reality of the raid. The initial shock wore off, replaced by the frontier instinct for defense. Shots rang out from the street as citizens and local lawmen began to engage the outlaws. Bullets slapped against the side of the train, shattering windows and sending glass flying across the seats. Crawford stood on the platform of the car, exposed and defiant, returning fire into the darkness of the town. He saw the muzzle flashes from the hotel balcony and the livery stable across the street. He fired back, aiming at the flashes, his shots deliberate and suppressed. He was in his element, a chaotic firefight where the rules of civilization were suspended. He laughed, a harsh barking sound that was lost in the roar of the gunfire and the hissing of the steam. "Come on!" he yelled at the unseen deputies, his silhouette framed by the light from the car door. "Come and get me, I'm right here." The gang retreated from the train under a hail of lead. They mounted their horses behind the depot, spurring them into a gallop. They rode through the streets of Noata, firing their Winchesters into the storefronts, shattering the plate glass windows of the general store and the pharmacy, sending the residents diving for cover behind rain barrels and watering troughs. It was a display of dominance, a reminder that the town existed only at their sufferance. They were the lords of the night, and the town was their fiefdom. They escaped into the darkness, leaving the train standing at the platform, its passengers robbed and beaten, the town riddled with bullet holes. The robberies at Coretta and Noata marked the apex of the gang's power. They had shut down the rail lines, forcing the companies to suspend shipments of cash and to place armed guards on the express cars. They had terrorized the population to the point where travel became a gamble with death. The Iron Horse, the symbol of unstoppable progress, had been halted by a handful of men with Winchesters. But the victories were hollow and the price was steep. The net was closing with a terrifying inevitability. The railroad companies, powerful corporations with unlimited resources and influence in Washington, hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The federal government increased the rewards to staggering sums. The pressure on the gang became unbearable. The unity that had held them together began to fracture under the weight of the paranoia. Bill Cook and Crawford argued over the division of the loot and the next course of action. The men were exhausted, sleeping in their clothes, eating cold food, and looking over their shoulders every second of every day. Crawford felt the isolation deepening as the weather turned colder. He rode at the rear of the column, watching the backs of his companions. He knew that loyalty was a commodity that depreciated quickly when the price on a man's head reached thousands of dollars. He trusted no one. He kept his guns loaded and his back to the wall. The train robberies had brought him money, but they had bought him no peace. They had only bought him a higher profile target on his back. The terror on the Iron Horse had solidified his image in the public mind. He was no longer just a killer. He was a predator who struck at the heart of progress. The newspapers called him a fiend, a wolf, a demon. Crawford read the clippings when they raided a mail pouch, scanning the ink-stained columns by firelight. He felt a strange detachment from the words. They were describing a character, a legend, a monster. He was just a man who was cold, tired, and running out of places to hide. The raid on the trains had shifted the dynamic of the hunt. It was no longer a local matter for the marshals in Fort Smith. It was a corporate matter. The railroads demanded results. They pressured the Department of Justice. They put bounties on the gang members, dead or alive. The message was clear. The flow of commerce would not be interrupted by a group of bandits in the Indian Territory. The machine was coming for them, grinding forward with the same unstoppable momentum as the locomotives they had briefly halted. Crawford sensed the shift in the wind. He knew that the days of open riding were over. They had to go to ground. They had to split up. The Caretta and Noata raids were the crescendo of their symphony of violence. Now came the silence. Now came the long, lonely winter where every shadow held a marshal and every friend was a potential traitor. He looked at his hands, stained with gun oil and the dirt of the trail. They were the hands of a destroyer. He had stopped the trains. He had made the iron horses scream. But the tracks remained. The steel rails still cut through the land, indifferent to his rage, stretching out toward a future that had no place for him. The trains would run again tomorrow. The system was too big to kill. He was just a flea biting at the hide of a giant, and the giant was beginning to scratch. The gang dispersed into the hills, seeking refuge in the deep timber of the Creek Nation. Crawford rode alone for a time, letting the solitude wash over him. He remembered the faces of the passengers on the train, the fear in their eyes. That fear was the only thing that felt real. It was the only validation of his existence. As long as they feared him, he was alive. As long as they trembled when they heard the name Cherokee Bill, he held power. He checked the load in his revolver, spinning the cylinder. The click sounded like the ticking of a clock. Time was running out. The rails led to the gallows, and he was riding the express train to the end of the line. He spurred his horse, disappearing into the black timber, a shadow swallowed by the night, leaving behind the smoking memory of the terror he had unleashed upon the iron road. The cold wind of late October whipped through the trees, whispering of the winter to come, a winter that Crawford Goldsby would not spend in freedom. November 8th, 1894, settled over the town of Lenipa with a biting chill that signaled the harsh approach of winter in the Cherokee Nation. The sky was a flat, bruised sheet of gray steel hanging low over the prairie and threatening snow that the air was too dry to deliver. Lenipa, a small settlement clinging to the edge of the railroad tracks in the Kuiskui district, huddled against the wind. The streets were treacherous ribbons of frozen mud, rutted deep by the passage of wagons and hardened by the frost. The town smelled of coal smoke and damp wood, a place where commerce and survival intertwined in the few false-fronted buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. Crawford Goldsby, riding under the name and growing shadow of Cherokee Bill, approached the town from the south. He was not alone. At his side rode Jackie Williams, a younger, impressionable outlaw who had been drawn into the orbit of the Cook gang by the gravity of their reputation. They moved their horses at a walk, conserving the animals' energy for the inevitable flight. Crawford wore a heavy coat against the cold, his collar turned up to mask his face, his hat pulled low. The Winchester rifle, the instrument of his new trade, rested across the pommel of his saddle, a cold weight of blued steel and walnut. They did not ride with the caution of men fearing capture, but with the arrogance of men who believed they owned the territory. The success of the train robberies and the string of unpunished murders had created a psychological armor around Crawford. He believed in his own invincibility. He looked at the town of Lenipa not as a community of people, but as a resource to be harvested. The destination was the Shootout and Son General Store, the largest mercantile establishment in the town, a place known to hold cash, ammunition, and the goods necessary to sustain men living in the brush. The time was just after noon. The lunch hour had thinned the streets, driving most citizens indoors to the warmth of their stoves. Crawford and Williams hitched their horses at the rack in front of the store. The animals stood heads down, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Crawford checked the street one last time. His eyes were hard, scanning for the glint of a badge or the profile of a rifleman. He saw only a few pedestrians hurrying against the wind, their heads tucked into their coats. The coast was clear. They entered the store with the bells above the door announcing their arrival. The interior was a cavern of commerce, smelling of pickle brine, oiled leather, ground coffee, and kerosene. The shelves were stocked with the necessities of frontier life, bolts of calico, tin canned peaches, boxes of cartridges, and heavy wool blankets. At the rear of the store, the office area was partitioned off, housing the safe and the ledger books. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly from routine business to absolute terror. There were men in the store, clerks, and a few customers. They looked up as the two strangers entered, their smiles of greeting dying on their lips as they saw the weapons. Crawford did not speak immediately. He let the visual impact of the Winchester do the work. He walked to the center of the room, his spurs ringing on the wooden floorboards, commanding the space with his physical size and the palpable menace that radiated from him. "Hands up," he said. The command was quiet, almost bored. "Everyone against the wall." The clerks scrambled to obey, dropping their brooms and pencils. A customer near the counter, a man buying flour, raised his hands slowly, his eyes fixed on the black bore of the rifle. Jackie Williams moved to the cash drawer, scooping out the bills and silver coins, his movements jerky and nervous. Crawford stood guard, his eyes darting around the room, watching for any sign of resistance. He was a coil of tension, a predator waiting for the prey to bolt. "The safe," Crawford ordered, gesturing with the barrel of the rifle toward the back office. "Open it." One of the clerks, a trembling man with spectacles, moved to the heavy iron box. He fumbled with the dial, his fingers slick with sweat despite the cold. Crawford watched him, his patience thinning. He hated the waiting. The silence in the store was heavy, broken only by the clicking of the safe tumblers and the wind rattling the window panes. While the robbery progressed in the main room, the world outside continued to turn. Across the street and slightly down from the Shootout store, a building was undergoing renovation. Ernest Melton, a painter by trade, was working on the second floor. Melton was a man of peace, a laborer who made his living with brushes and buckets rather than guns. He was not a lawman. He was not a hero. He was simply a man doing a job on a Thursday afternoon. Melton had heard the commotion. The sound of the horses, the bells, and perhaps the raised voices had drifted up to him. Curiosity, a human trait that often proves fatal in the presence of predators, drew him to the window. He wiped a spot of paint from his hand and leaned forward, peering through the glass to see what was happening at the general store. He was an observer, a witness to the drama unfolding across the muddy street. He had no weapon. He had no intent to intervene. He just wanted to see. Inside the store, Crawford's peripheral vision caught the movement. The store had large plate glass windows in the front, designed to display merchandise to the street. Through the glass, across the expanse of the road, Crawford saw the face of Ernest Melton in the upper window of the opposite building. To a rational mind, Melton was harmless. He was a face in a window 70 yards away. But Crawford Goldsby was no longer operating with a rational mind. He was operating on the logic of the hunted. In his world, eyes meant witnesses. Witnesses meant marshals. Marshals meant the rope. The sight of the man watching him triggered an immediate violent reflex. It was not a calculated decision to eliminate a threat. It was an instinctive reaction to being observed. "There's someone watching," Crawford muttered. He did not shout a warning. He did not wave the man away. He simply pivoted his torso, bringing the Winchester up to his shoulder. The motion was fluid, practiced thousands of times in the canyons of the Creek Nation. He aligned the sights on the distant face framed by the window sash. The clerks in the store gasped, realizing too late what was happening. They watched in horror as the outlaw took aim at a target they couldn't even see clearly. Crawford squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared in the confined space of the store, a deafening thunderclap that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. The bullet, a .44 caliber slug, smashed through the plate glass window of the Shoefelt store, showering the sidewalk outside with shards. It traversed the street in a fraction of a second. Ernest Melton never heard the shot. The bullet struck him in the head, shattering his skull. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. The painter collapsed backward, falling away from the window, his life extinguished before his body hit the floor. He died with his curiosity unsatisfied, killed for the simple crime of looking. "Got him," Crawford said. He lowered the rifle, working the lever to eject the spent casing. The brass shell hit the floor with a hollow chink, rolling to a stop near the boot of the terrified clerk at the safe. The senselessness of the act froze the room. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a shootout with a sheriff. This was murder in its purest, most distilled form. A man had been executed for looking out a window. The clerks stared at Crawford with a new level of terror. They realized they were in the presence of a man who had severed all ties with human empathy. He killed as casually as he breathed. "Hurry up with that money," Crawford snapped, turning his attention back to the safe as if he had just swatted a fly. The killing of Melton was already in the past, a completed task that required no further thought. The clerk, now sobbing openly, swung the safe door open. Jackie Williams shoved the contents into a sack, bundles of notes, rolls of coins. It was a substantial haul, but the weight of the gold was nothing compared to the weight of the sin they had just accrued. Even Williams, an outlaw himself, looked at Crawford with a mixture of awe and fear. He had seen violence, but this was different. This was cold. "Let's go," Crawford commanded. They backed out of the store, keeping their weapons trained on the hostages. They stepped out onto the sidewalk, the glass from the broken window crunching under their boots. The cold wind hit them, carrying the smell of the coming snow. Crawford vaulted into his saddle, the sack of money tied to his horn. He looked up at the window across the street. The face was gone. The pain was empty. The town of Lenipa was beginning to react. The sound of the gunshot had alerted the citizens. Men were emerging from the saloon and the blacksmith shop, weapons in hand. A shout went up. "Robbery! They killed a man!" Crawford spurred his horse, wheeling the animal around in the mud. He raised his rifle one-handed and fired a shot down the main street, not aiming at anyone in particular, but sending a message of defiance. The bullet kicked up a spray of frozen mud near the post office. The citizens dived for cover. "Ride!" he yelled to Williams. They tore out of Lenipa, their horses' hooves hammering the frozen ground. They headed north toward the open prairie and the sanctuary of the timber along the Verdigris River. They rode hard, putting distance between themselves and the scene of the crime. The wind whipped tears from their eyes, freezing on their cheeks. Back in Lenipa, the townspeople rushed to the building across the street. They found Ernest Melton lying on the floorboards, his paint clothes stained with the bright red of his own blood. The sight sickened even the hardest men in the group. Melton was a neighbor. He was a worker. He had no part in the war between the outlaws and the government. His death was a violation of the unwritten rules of the frontier. You killed men who fought back. You killed men who held a gun. You did not kill a painter in a window. The telegraph lines began to hum within minutes. The message went out to Fort Smith, to Judge Isaac Parker, to the marshals roaming the territory. The robbery was mentioned, but the murder was the headline. Cherokee Bill kills Ernest Melton in Lenipa. Innocent bystander shot dead. As Crawford rode north, the adrenaline of the robbery began to fade, replaced by the cold reality of the flight. He did not feel guilt. His mind did not process the morality of the action. He justified it with the twisted logic of the fugitive. Melton was a threat because he was watching. Therefore, Melton had to be removed. It was a tactical decision. But deep in the recesses of his consciousness, Crawford knew that something had shifted. The killing of Ernest Melton was the final nail in his coffin. The public, who had perhaps held a sneaking admiration for the daring train robber, turned on him completely. He was now a pariah, a child killer, a murderer of workers. The fear he inspired was no longer mixed with respect. It was pure, unadulterated loathing. The gang stopped miles outside of town to rest the horses. The sky had darkened further, and the first flakes of snow began to drift down, settling on the shoulders of their coats. Crawford sat on a fallen log, reloading his Winchester. He pushed the cartridges into the loading gate, 1, 2, 3. He looked at the brass casings. They were clean, shiny, lethal. "Why did you shoot him, Bill?" Jackie Williams asked, breaking the silence. The younger outlaw's voice was tentative, testing the waters. "He was just looking." Crawford looked up, his eyes dark and empty as the barrel of his rifle. "He saw me," he said simply. "Nobody looks at me unless I say so." The answer chilled Williams more than the wind. It revealed the absolute narcissism of the killer. Crawford Goldsby believed that the world revolved around him and that any intrusion into his sphere of control was a capital offense. He had become a god of his own small, violent universe, dispensing death with the capriciousness of a storm. The loot from the Shootout store was counted. It was a good take, enough to keep them running for a few weeks. But the money felt tainted. It was blood money, heavier than lead. They divided it in silence, the joy of the score absent. They knew that this robbery would bring a heat they had never experienced before. The killing of a federal officer was one thing. The slaughter of a civilian like Melton was a crime that demanded a reckoning. As the snow began to fall harder, covering the tracks of their escape, Crawford mounted his horse again. He pulled his collar up. The landscape was turning white, erasing the colors of the world. He felt a strange sense of finality. The run was coming to an end. He could feel it in the cold air. He had killed too many, he had pushed too far. The image of the painter in the window did not haunt him. It did not keep him awake. It was just another frame in the long reel of violence that played in his head. But for the law, for the judge in Fort Smith, and for the people of the Indian Territory, the image of Ernest Melton falling back from the glass was the image that would hang Cherokee Bill. It was the act that stripped away the last vestige of the Robin Hood myth and revealed the cold-blooded reptile beneath. Crawford turned his horse toward the deep timber. He was riding into a winter that offered no warmth, no shelter, and no forgiveness. The painter was dead, the store was robbed, and Cherokee Bill was a dead man riding, carrying the weight of a senseless murder that would echo all the way to the gallows. The snow covered the ground, but it could not cover the stain of what had happened in Lenipa. The clock had started ticking on the final act of his life, and the hands were moving fast. January 29th, 1895, arrived in the Cherokee Nation shrouded in the gray, biting cold of deep winter. The wind howled across the prairie, stripping the last dead leaves from the blackjack oaks and driving the frost deep into the red earth. 5 miles east of Noata, the farmhouse of Ike Rogers stood as a solitary outpost against the bleak landscape. Smoke curled from the chimney, snatched away instantly by the gale, suggesting a warmth inside that was entirely deceptive. Inside the rough-hewn walls, a trap had been baited with the two things Crawford Goldsby, the fugitive known as Cherokee Bill, could not resist: the company of a woman and the false security of a friend. Ike Rogers was a man who walked the jagged line between the law and the outlaw world. A former deputy marshal and a man of mixed African and Cherokee blood like Bill, he had known the outlaw for years. They had shared whiskey, trails, and the peculiar bond of men who lived on the fringes of white society. But the dynamic had shifted. The reward for Cherokee Bill had climbed to $1,300, a fortune in a land where a man might kill for a pair of boots. Rogers had made a deal with the authorities. He would deliver the most dangerous man in the territory, not with a gunfight on the open plains, but with treachery within his own home. To aid him, he had enlisted Clint Scales, a white deputy from the neighbors who posed as a casual visitor. The lure was Maggie Glass, a young woman for whom Bill held a deep, reckless affection. Rogers knew that Bill's isolation was his greatest weakness. The outlaw had been living like a wolf, sleeping in caves and snow-filled gullies, hunted by every man with a badge and a gun. He was exhausted, frozen and starving for human connection. When word reached him that he would be welcome at Rogers' place to see Maggie, the instinct for survival was overridden by the need for comfort. Bill arrived in the late afternoon. He rode his horse into the yard, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the habitual paranoia of the hunted. He wore a heavy coat, the collar turned up against the wind and his hat pulled low. The Winchester rifle, now an extension of his own body, rested across his saddle. He dismounted stiffly, the cold having settled into his joints. Rogers met him at the door, playing the role of the welcoming host with a terrifying coolness. He slapped Bill on the shoulder, ushered him in out of the wind, and offered him the seat nearest the fire. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by the flames in the hearth and a kerosene lamp on the table. Maggie Glass was there, her presence a softening agent in the hard room. She greeted Bill, but her eyes held a flicker of nervous tension that the outlaw, in his fatigue, failed to misinterpret. He saw it as worry for his safety, not knowledge of the betrayal. Clint Scales sat in the corner, whittling a stick, affecting the air of a man with nowhere to be. Rogers introduced him simply as a friend from down the road, stranded by the weather. Bill sat, but he did not relax. He kept his Winchester between his knees, his hand resting on the receiver. He accepted a plate of food, pork, beans, and cornbread, and ate with his left hand, keeping his right free near the trigger guard. The heat of the fire began to thaw his frozen limbs, but it could not melt the ice in his gut. He was a creature of instinct, and the air in the cabin felt wrong. It was too quiet. The conversation was too forced. Rogers was too accommodating. The evening stretched out, a torture of slow minutes. Rogers produced a jug of whiskey, pouring generous measures into tin cups. He urged Bill to drink, to warm his blood, to wash away the dust of the trail. Bill drank, but he did not get drunk. He sipped the burning liquid, his dark eyes flicking from Rogers to Scales, then to the windows. He knew that if the marshals were outside, they would wait for darkness. He did not know that the marshals were sitting in the room with him, waiting for him to close his eyes. Night fell like a hammer. The wind increased its velocity, rattling the window panes and whistling through the chinking of the logs. Rogers suggested they turn in. He offered Bill the bed, a gesture of hospitality that also served to confine the target to a specific location. Bill refused. He would not separate himself from his weapons, or place himself in a position where he could be easily pinned. He dragged a mattress onto the floor near the fire, positioning himself so that he could see the door and the window. He laid his Winchester beside him, the barrel pointing toward the entrance. He placed his 2 revolvers under the pillow. The long night began. It was a siege of silence. Rogers and Scales took the bed in the corner, feigning sleep, but their eyes remained open in the shadows. They watched the outlaw on the floor. They waited for the deep, rhythmic breathing of true slumber, the moment when the guard drops and the body surrenders to exhaustion. But Bill did not surrender. He lay on his back, his eyes staring up at the rough timber of the ceiling. Every pop of the firewood, every creak of the settling house caused his hand to tighten on the pistol grip. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing coals, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The cold crept back in from the edges of the house. Rogers lay in the darkness, his mind racing. He knew that he could not take Bill in a fair fight. If the outlaw woke up with a gun in his hand, Rogers and Scales would be dead before they cleared their holsters. They needed an advantage. They needed total surprise. They watched the rise and fall of Bill's chest, looking for the hitch of deep sleep. Twice during the night, Bill sat up abruptly, his revolver sweeping the room. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice raspy with fatigue. "Just the wind, Bill," Rogers soothed from the darkness. "Just the wind. Go back to sleep." Bill lay back down, but the tension remained wire-tight. He was fighting a war against his own biology. His body screamed for rest, but his mind screamed for vigilance. He drifted into light, fitful dozes, waking with a start at the slightest provocation. The psychological strain on the 3 men was immense. It was a silent standoff, a contest of wills played out in a dark room on the frozen prairie. The dawn of January 30th arrived gray and cheerless. The light seeped through the cracks in the shutters, revealing the haggard faces of the men. No one had slept. The air in the cabin was stale, thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Rogers rose first, stirring the fire and adding fresh logs. He moved with a casual deliberation, trying to normalize the morning routine. He put a pot of coffee on the grate. The smell of the brewing grounds filled the room, a scent of domesticity that stood in stark contrast to the violence hanging in the air. Bill sat up. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed and sunken, his face drawn. He had survived the night, but the effort had drained him. He pulled on his boots, checking his weapons immediately. He stood up, stretching his large frame, the Winchester dangling from his hand. He was alive. He was free. He began to think about the trail again, about moving on before the sun got too high. "Stay for breakfast," Rogers urged. "Maggie's making biscuits. You can't ride on an empty stomach." Bill hesitated. The warmth of the fire was seductive. The smell of the coffee was a siren song. He nodded, leaning his rifle against the wall, though he kept it within arm's reach. He kept his revolvers in his belt. Maggie began to work the dough, her movements jerky and frightened. She knew what was coming. She wanted to warn him, perhaps, but fear of Rogers and the law kept her silent. The moment of crisis arrived with banal simplicity. Bill rolled a cigarette, his fingers deft and quick. He placed the tobacco-filled paper between his lips. He needed a light. He looked at the fire roaring now with new wood. He looked at the matchbox on the mantel, but it was empty or out of reach. He turned to the hearth. "Give me a light, Ike," Bill said, leaning forward. He bent down, reaching for a burning splinter of wood to light his smoke. His attention focused on the flame. His hands were occupied. His head was lowered. It was the fraction of a second Rogers had waited 14 hours for. As Bill leaned in, exposing the back of his head and neck, Ike Rogers struck. He did not use a gun. He picked up a heavy iron fire poker. Some accounts say a stick of firewood, others a pistol barrel, but the force was blunt and massive, and swung it with all his strength. The blow connected with the back of Bill's skull with a sickening thud. The impact would have killed a lesser man or rendered him instantly unconscious. But Crawford Goldsby was built of iron and rage. He staggered forward, dropping the cigarette, his vision exploding into white light. He roared, a sound of pure animal fury, and tried to rise. He reached for his guns. "Get him!" Rogers screamed. Clint Scales threw himself onto the outlaw's back. Rogers dropped the weapon and tackled Bill from the front. The three men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and dust. The table was overturned, sending the coffee pot flying. The struggle was primal. Bill fought with the strength of a desperate giant. He bucked and twisted, throwing the men around the room. His hand clawed for his revolver, his fingers brushing the grip. Rogers jammed his hand into the mechanism of the gun, preventing the hammer from rising. He punched Bill in the face, a short, chopping blow. Scales wrapped his arm around Bill's throat, trying to choke him out. They rolled across the floorboards, smashing into the walls. Maggie Glass screamed and ran for the door, fleeing the violence that had erupted in her kitchen. "Shoot him! Shoot him!" Rogers yelled to Scales, but they were too close, too entangled. A shot might kill the wrong man. They had to subdue him with weight and leverage. They pinned his arms, wrenching them behind his back. The handcuffs, heavy steel bracelets, were snapped onto his wrists. The metallic click of the locking mechanism signaled the end of the freedom of Cherokee Bill. Bill lay on the floor, his chest heaving, blood streaming from the wound on his head and from his nose. He glared up at Ike Rogers. The realization of the betrayal hit him harder than the blow from the iron. He had been sold. He had been tricked. The man he had called friend had waited for him to light a cigarette and then struck him from behind. "You dirty traitor," Bill spat, the blood bubbling on his lips. "You never would have got me if I was awake. You had to wait until my back was turned." Rogers stood over him, panting, wiping the sweat from his eyes. He held the Winchester now. The balance of power had shifted permanently. "It's over, Bill," Rogers said. "The law wants you and the money is good." They did not give him time to recover. They dragged him to his feet, checking the cuffs to ensure they were tight. They stripped him of his weapons, the Winchesters, the revolvers, the knife. They found the money from the robberies in his pockets, the blood money that had bought him nothing but this moment of humiliation. Rogers hitched up a wagon. They threw Bill into the back, chaining his legs to the floorboards. Scales sat with a shotgun leveled at the prisoner's chest. Rogers took the reins. They drove out of the yard, leaving the farmhouse behind. The wind was still blowing, colder than before. The journey to the railhead at Noata was a funeral procession for a living man. Bill sat in the wagon bed, the cold steel of the chains biting into his skin. He looked at the back of Ike Rogers' head. He memorized the shape of it. He vowed that if he ever got free, if he ever slipped these chains, Ike Rogers would be the first man to die. "You won't keep me," Bill growled, his voice low over the rattle of the wagon wheels. "I'll get loose, and when I do, I'm coming back to this house." Rogers did not look back. He snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. He wanted to be rid of his cargo. He wanted to turn the monster over to the federal marshals and collect his $1,300. He knew that he had made an enemy who would haunt him for the rest of his life, however short that might be. They reached the station at Noata, the very depot Bill had terrorized months before. A crowd gathered quickly. The news spread by telegraph. Cherokee Bill is taken. The locals came to gawk at the caged tiger. They stared at the man in the wagon, seeing the blood on his face and the chains on his limbs. They saw a young man, barely 19, who looked back at them with eyes that held no fear, only a burning, focused hatred. Deputies took custody of the prisoner. They loaded him onto a train bound for Fort Smith, Arkansas. The iron horse, which he had robbed and mocked, was now his jailer. He was placed in the baggage car, chained to the wall. The train lurched into motion, the whistle blowing a long, mournful note. As the landscape of the Cherokee Nation rolled past the open door of the baggage car, Crawford watched it disappear. He saw the timber where he had hidden, the creeks he had crossed, the hills that had been his fortress. He was leaving his home. He was heading into the belly of the beast, to the court of the hanging judge. The capture at Noata was not a glorious last stand. It was a dirty, gritty piece of business conducted with a fire poker and a pair of handcuffs. It lacked the romance of the dime novels. There was no shootout at high noon. There was just a tired boy, a treacherous friend, and a cheap ambush in a cold kitchen. But the fire in Crawford's belly was not extinguished. He sat in the chains, testing their strength. He looked at the deputies guarding him. He was calculating. He was planning. The capture was a setback, not an end. He was Cherokee Bill. He had killed men for looking at him wrong. He had robbed trains. He had terrorized a territory. He would not die in a cell. The train rattled south, carrying the most dangerous man in the West toward his judgment. But in the darkness of the baggage car, Crawford Goldsby smiled a bloody, broken smile. The long night at Noata was over, but the war was not. He had one card left to play, and he intended to play it with a gun in his hand. July 26, 1895, covered the city of Fort Smith, Arkansas, under a blanket of humidity that turned the air into a physical weight. Beneath the federal courthouse, in the basement dungeon known infamously as Hell on the Border, the heat was magnified by the massive stone walls and the press of human bodies. The jail was a subterranean purgatory, a dark, damp warren of iron and masonry that housed the most violent men in the Indian Territory. The air stagnated, heavy with the reek of unwashed wool, tobacco juice, open latrine buckets, and the sour sweat of men waiting to die. The ventilation was non-existent, the atmosphere a miasma of despair and aggression that clung to the skin like oil. Crawford Goldsby, the prisoner known as Cherokee Bill, sat in his cell on the corridor dubbed Murderer's Row. He was a condemned man. The trial for the murder of Ernest Melton had concluded in the spring, and Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge, had pronounced the sentence of death by hanging. The appeals process dragged on, a slow bureaucratic torture that offered false hope to some, but only deepened the rage in Crawford. He was 20 years old. He had spent his 19th year robbing and killing, and now he spent his 20th staring at the limestone blocks that encased him. He was a caged tiger pacing the few feet of his cell, his muscles twitching with an energy that had no outlet. The jail operated on a rhythm of clangor and shouting. Guards walked the corridors, their boot heels striking the stone floors, keys jingling as a constant reminder of the authority they held. Among them was Lawrence Keating, a turnkey known as Larry. Keating was a family man, a respected veteran of the Civil War, and a guard who treated the prisoners with a firm but fair hand. He did not abuse them, nor did he fear them. He walked the row with the confidence of a man who believed the iron bars were sufficient to contain the animals inside. He knew their names, their crimes, and their tricks, but he underestimated the depth of their desperation. Crawford watched Keating through the grate. He did not see a man. He saw a uniform. He saw the personification of the system that intended to stretch his neck. The waiting had eroded Crawford's patience. He was not a man built for confinement. The energy that had driven him to jump trains and outrun posses had nowhere to go. It turned inward, pressurizing his mind until the only release was an explosion of violence. He had nothing to lose. The noose was already waiting. If he died in a hail of bullets, it would be a quicker, cleaner exit than the slow drop and the strangulation of the gallows. The plan for the break was born in whispers passed between the cells during the few moments of relative quiet. It relied on the corruption or the carelessness of those allowed to move freely. A trustee, a prisoner granted special privileges to perform chores, became the conduit. Sherman Van, serving time for a lesser offense, had access to the outside world and the interior of the cells. Through a complex exchange of signals and opportunities, perhaps a bribe paid by outside sympathizers, perhaps a threat, a revolver, a .45 caliber Colt, was smuggled into the jail. The weapon arrived wrapped in a bundle of laundry or perhaps hidden in the false bottom of a bucket of food. The method was less significant than the result. Crawford felt the weight of the steel in his hand. It was cold, heavy, and familiar. It felt like a restoration of his manhood. Hiding the gun in his bedding, checking it by feel in the dark, he waited. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds, 6 chances to change the ending of his story. He sat on his bunk, feeling the hard metal against his leg, a secret that burned with potential energy. The evening count began at 6 o'clock. The light in the basement was dimming, the shadows lengthening in the corners of the cells as the sun dipped below the courthouse roof. The prisoners were returning to their cells from the day room corridor. It was a time of transition, a moment when the strict order of the jail loosened slightly as men moved into position for the night lockup. The noise level was high, a cacophony of shouting, jeering, and the clanging of iron doors. Keating entered the corridor, accompanied by guard Campbell Eoff. They moved down the line, checking the bars, ensuring the men were secured. They carried their service revolvers, but they did not have them drawn. They expected sullen compliance, the usual grumbling of men being caged for the night. They did not expect war. They moved with the routine efficiency of men finishing a shift, thinking perhaps of supper or the cool air outside. Crawford waited until Keating was close. The turnkey approached the cell door, intent on the locking mechanism. Crawford did not hesitate. He produced the revolver from beneath his shirt, the movement a blur in the dim light. He did not fire immediately. He wanted control. He wanted them to know who was in charge. He wanted to see the fear in their eyes before the violence started. "Throw them up, Keating," Crawford commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls, cutting through the din of the jail. "I have the drop on you." The sudden appearance of a gun in the hands of a condemned man shattered the routine. Keating stopped. He looked at Crawford, at the dark muzzle of the Colt pointing through the bars. A lesser man might have frozen or complied. Keating was not a lesser man. He was a guard who took his duty seriously. He knew that allowing an armed killer to escape into the city would endanger innocent lives. He made a choice. He reached for the revolver on his hip, his hand moving with the reflex of a soldier. It was the movement Crawford had anticipated. He fired. The gunshot in the confined space was deafening, a concussion that slammed against the eardrums of every man in the block. The bullet struck Larry Keating in the stomach, punching through his vest and driving deep into his gut. The impact knocked the breath from him. He staggered back, his hand still grappling for his weapon, his face registering the shock of the blow. He did not fall immediately, his discipline keeping him upright for a terrible second. Crawford did not pause to see the result. He cocked the hammer and fired again. The second shot hit Keating in the chest, a fatal wound that severed the major vessels. Keating collapsed onto the stone floor, his blood beginning to pool on the cold flags. He groaned once, a terrible wet sound, and then lay still. The smell of powder smoke instantly filled the corridor, sharp and stinging. Pandemonium erupted. The other prisoners screamed and shouted, diving for the corners of their cells to avoid the crossfire. Campbell Eoff, seeing his partner fall, drew his weapon. He fired at Crawford, the bullet sparking off the iron bars, sending splinters of lead singing through the air. Crawford returned fire, the muzzle flash illuminating the dark corridor like a strobe light. The noise was a continuous roar, trapped by the stone walls. "Get back!" Crawford yelled, firing wildly down the hallway. "I'll kill the lot of you." Eoff retreated, firing as he went, seeking the safety of the heavy iron door that separated the cell block from the guard room. He managed to escape, slamming the door shut and turning the heavy key. Crawford was now in control of the corridor, but he was also trapped. The escape route he had envisioned was blocked. He was sealed in the belly of the beast with a dead guard and a row of terrified felons. Smoke from the black powder cartridges filled the air, a thick, acrid fog that stung the eyes and obscured vision. The smell of sulfur mixed with the metallic scent of fresh blood. Crawford paced the corridor, the smoking gun in his hand. He went to Keating's body. He looked down at the man he had just killed. He took Keating's revolver, a shiny new weapon, and added it to his arsenal. He now had 2 guns and plenty of ammunition. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a wild, chaotic high. "Come on back," he taunted the guards on the other side of the door. "I'm ready for you. Bring the whole damn marshal's service." The sound of the shooting had alerted the entire building. Marshal George Crump and other deputies rushed to the basement. They surrounded the exterior of the jail, covering the windows with rifles. A crowd of citizens, drawn by the news that Cherokee Bill was breaking out, began to gather in the street above. The mood was ugly. Men spoke of lynching, of storming the jail and dragging the killer out. They brought torches and ropes, their voices a low rumble of mob violence. Inside the corridor, the standoff settled into a tense siege. Crawford moved back and forth, firing occasional shots at the door or the windows to keep the guards at bay. He knew he could not get out. The heavy door was impregnable to pistol fire. He was pacing a cage of his own making, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, turning to a sour realization of futility. He checked the loads in both guns. He was ready to die, but he wanted to take as many blue suits with him as he could. The other prisoners in Murderer's Row watched him with a mixture of awe and resentment. They were trapped in the line of fire. If the marshals decided to rush the block or fire blindly through the windows, the inmates would be the collateral damage. George Pierce, another outlaw in the block, shouted at Bill to give it up, but Bill ignored him. He was in a trance of violence, his mind focused solely on the next target. He was the king of the dungeon for this brief, bloody hour. Marshal Crump knew that a direct assault would result in a bloodbath. He needed to talk Bill down. He needed a negotiator. He turned to Henry Starr. Henry Starr was a legend in his own right, a relative of the notorious Sam Starr and Belle Starr. Henry was a bank robber of a different breed, intelligent, articulate, and possessed of a certain code of honor. He was also a prisoner in the jail, housed in a different section. Crump had Starr brought down. He explained the situation. "He's got 2 guns, Henry," Crump said, his face grim. "He's killed Keating. If we go in, more men die. Go talk to him. He might listen to you." Starr agreed. It was an act of immense physical courage. He was unarmed. He would be walking into a smoke-filled corridor facing a man who had just committed murder and had nothing to lose. The guard unlocked the door. Starr stepped into the gloom of Murderer's Row. "Bill?" Starr called out, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension. "It's Henry." Crawford stopped pacing. He saw the silhouette of Starr in the doorway. He raised his pistols. "Don't come in, Henry. I'll shoot. I swear it." Starr did not stop. He walked slowly down the corridor, his hands open and visible. He ignored the body of Lawrence Keating lying on the floor. He focused his eyes on Crawford. "Put the guns down, Bill. It's over. You can't get out." "I ain't giving up," Crawford snarled. "I want to die right here. I want to take some more with me. I ain't going to the rope." "You've done enough," Starr said, stopping a few feet from the muzzle of Crawford's gun. "Keating is dead. You're not going to escape. If they come in here, they'll kill everyone in this row. Is that what you want? You want to kill these other boys? You want their blood on you too?" Crawford looked at the other prisoners huddled in their cells. He looked at Starr. The rage that had sustained him began to flicker. He respected Starr. Henry was a Cherokee, a man who had ridden the outlaw trail but kept his dignity. To be told by Henry Starr that the fight was foolish carried a weight that no marshal could replicate. "They'll hang me anyway," Crawford said, his voice dropping, the bravado slipping away. "They will," Starr admitted. He did not lie. "But don't die like a rat in a hole. Give me the guns, Bill. Walk out like a man. Show them you aren't afraid of the end." The logic pierced the fog of Crawford's anger. The rebellion had failed. He had killed a guard, but he was still inside the stone walls. The temporary power he had felt when he pulled the trigger was gone, replaced by the crushing reality of his position. He looked at the revolver in his hand, the instrument of his power and his destruction. He hesitated. The silence in the corridor was absolute. The guards outside held their breath. The prisoners watched the two outlaws, the young wolf and the older lion, standing amidst the smoke. Slowly, Crawford lowered the hammers of the revolvers. He turned the handles toward Henry Starr. "Here," he said. Starr took the weapons. He did not smile. He nodded gravely. "You did the right thing, Bill." Starr walked back to the door, handing the guns to Marshal Crump. The tension broke. The deputies swarmed into the corridor, seizing Crawford. They did not treat him gently. They slammed him against the wall, shackling his hands and feet with heavy chains. They dragged him past the body of Larry Keating. Crawford looked down at the dead man one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a cold, hard defiance. As they hauled him away to solitary confinement, a reporter or a deputy asked him why he did it. Why kill a man when escape was impossible? "I just wanted to kill a few more of you," Crawford replied. The words were simple, literal, and chilling. They defined his entire existence. He was not fighting for freedom anymore, he was fighting for the body count. The aftermath of the rebellion was swift and brutal. The city of Fort Smith was in an uproar. Larry Keating was given a hero's funeral attended by thousands. The hatred for Cherokee Bill reached a fever pitch. He was moved to a secure cell, chained to the floor, watched 24 hours a day. The privileges of the prisoners were revoked. The hell on the border became even more hellish. For Crawford, the failure of the escape was the final defeat. He had tried to blast his way out of the world's judgment, and he had failed. He was now just waiting for the calendar to turn. The murder of Keating expedited the legal process. There would be no successful appeals now. The Supreme Court would not look kindly on a man who murdered his jailer. In the dark of his isolation cell, Crawford replayed the shooting. He saw Keating reach for his gun. He felt the recoil of the Colt. It was a memory he cherished. It was his last act of agency, his last assertion of control over a life that had spiraled into chaos. He did not regret killing Keating. In his mind, Keating was a soldier on the other side of the war. The rebellion of Murderers Row solidified Cherokee Bill's legacy as the most dangerous man to ever set foot in the Indian Territory. Even in chains, even inside a federal dungeon, he was lethal. The story of the standoff, of the smoke and the blood, and of Henry Starr's walk into the fire became part of the folklore of the West. But for Crawford Goldsby, sitting in the dark, the legend meant nothing. He was just a 20-year-old boy with cold iron on his wrists and the ghost of a good man standing in the corner of his cell. The summer heat continued to bake the prison, turning it into an oven. The air remained heavy and still. The silence returned to the dungeon. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of the grave waiting for its tenant. The rebellion was over. The executioner was sharpening his knife. The date was set, and the clock on the wall of the guard room ticked away the remaining seconds of a life lived fast, hard, and without mercy. The legal machinery of the United States government, often criticized for its sluggish rotation in the chaotic sprawl of the frontier, spun with a terrifying grinding velocity following the murder of Lawrence Keating. Judge Isaac Parker, the architect of law and order in the Indian Territory, was a man near the end of his own life, his body failing from dropsy and exhaustion. But his resolve remained as hard as the granite foundation of the federal courthouse. He viewed Crawford Goldsby not merely as a criminal, but as a malignant tumor that had to be excised to save the body of society. The failed breakout and the cold-blooded execution of a guard within the very walls of the federal jail stripped away any lingering sympathy or procedural delay. The Supreme Court affirmed the conviction for the murder of Ernest Melton, the painter in Lenipa, and the death of Keating served as the final accelerant. On a cold, damp day in late 1895, Crawford stood before the bench to receive the finalization of his sentence. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of anticipation. Judge Parker looked down from his high perch, his eyes weary but fierce, peering over the rim of his spectacles. He spoke of Crawford's depraved heart, a legal and moral classification defining a man void of social duty and fatally bent on mischief. He set the date for the execution, March 17, 1896. Crawford listened to the condemnation with the same stone-faced indifference he had worn since his capture at Noata. He did not beg. He did not weep. He simply nodded, accepting the date as one might accept a schedule for a train departure. The winter of 1896 passed with agonizing slowness in the solitude of the death cell. Crawford was isolated now, separated from the general population of the jail, to prevent any further incitement to rebellion. The chains on his ankles were heavy, biting into the flesh, a constant physical reminder of his reduced circumference of existence. He spent the days staring at the limestone blocks that encased him, counting the imperfections in the masonry. He conversed briefly with the guards who now watched him in shifts, men who kept their hands near their holsters and never took their eyes off the prisoner who had killed one of their own. The bravado of the outlaw trail had evaporated, leaving behind a core of icy, impenetrable stoicism. As the date approached, the city of Fort Smith began to prepare for the spectacle. Executions were public events, grim carnivals that drew spectators from miles around the Arkansas and Indian territories. The hotels filled to capacity. The saloons on Garrison Avenue did a brisk trade, the whiskey flowing as men speculated on whether the terror of the territory would break down at the end. The hanging of Cherokee Bill was the headline event of the decade, the closing chapter of a violent era that the civilizing forces were desperate to bury. The citizens wanted to see the monster dead. They wanted visual confirmation that the chaos was truly over. On the morning of March 17, 1896, the sun rose over the Arkansas River, burning off the river mist to reveal a crisp, clear spring day. The weather was incongruously beautiful, the kind of day that usually signaled the renewal of life, the budding of trees and the return of warmth, rather than the termination of a man's existence. Inside the jail, the routine of the death watch shifted into its final phase. Crawford woke early, or perhaps he had not slept at all. He rose from his cot, the chains rattling in the quiet of the dawn. He dressed with particular care. He had requested a new suit for the occasion, determined to die looking like a man of substance rather than a ragged fugitive or a broken prisoner. He put on a white shirt, buttoning it to the neck. He pulled on a pair of dark trousers and a black coat, smoothing the fabric over his broad shoulders. He pulled on polished boots, the leather gleaming in the dim light of the cell. He combed his dark, wavy hair. He looked into the small mirror provided to him and saw a 20-year-old boy dressed for his own funeral. The vanity of the outlaw remained intact. He would leave a corpse that commanded respect. His mother, Ellen Lynch, arrived at the jail for the final visit. The meeting was a scene of devastating restraint, stripped of the melodrama often found in fiction. Ellen had watched her son drift from the potential of the Carlisle school to the bloody mud of the territory. She had seen the posters, heard the stories of the train robberies, and now she stood before the iron bars to say goodbye to the child she had borne at Fort Concho. She did not hysterically weep. She was a woman forged by the hardships of the frontier, a woman who had survived abandonment and poverty. She held his hand through the grate, feeling the warmth of his skin one last time. "Be a man, Crawford," she told him, her voice firm, cutting through the silence of the corridor. "Die like a man." "I will, Mother," he replied. His voice was steady, lacking any tremor of fear. He showed more concern for her grief than for his own impending death. He urged her to leave before the final procession, sparing her the sight of the rope and the drop. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor, leaving her son to face the machinery of the state alone. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy iron door of the jail swung open. A roar went up from the crowd gathered in the prison yard and the streets beyond. Some 2,000 to 3,000 people pressed against the fences and the walls, craning their necks for a glimpse of the famous outlaw. They had come by wagon, by train, and on foot. There were white settlers, freedmen, and Cherokees, a cross-section of the society Crawford had warred against. The noise was a physical wave, a mixture of jeers, shouts, and the low, vibrating rumble of morbid curiosity. Crawford emerged into the sunlight, blinking against the sudden glare. He was flanked by Father Pius, a Catholic priest who had been attending him in his final days, and a phalanx of heavily armed deputies. The lawmen took no chances. Even on the walk to the scaffold, they treated him as a man who might explode into violence, a human grenade with the pin pulled. Crawford walked with a steady, rhythmic gait, the chains removed for the walk, but his arms bound. He did not drag his feet. He scanned the crowd, his dark eyes moving over the sea of faces with a dispassionate gaze. He saw the people he had terrorized, the people who had hunted him, and the people who simply wanted to see blood spilled on a Tuesday afternoon. He offered them no satisfaction of fear. He offered them only a mirror of their own fascination with death. The gallows at Fort Smith was a massive, grim structure built to hang multiple men at once, a testament to the volume of capital cases handled by Judge Parker's court. It stood high above the yard, a platform of rough-hewn timber accessed by a steep flight of 13 steps. Crawford looked up at the crossbeam. The rope hung there, a stark vertical line against the brilliant blue sky. The noose was knotted with precision, the heavy coil of the hangman's knot waiting to do its work. He began the ascent. He counted the steps. 1, 2, 3. His boots thudded on the wood. The crowd fell silent as he climbed, the hush spreading outward from the scaffold like a ripple in a pond. The wind blew softly, fluttering the hem of his black coat. He reached the platform and stepped onto the trap door. It was a square of wood held in place by a mechanical catch, the only solid ground separating him from eternity. The executioner, George Lawson, waited for him. Lawson was a professional, a man who viewed his grim task as a necessary function of the law, a mechanic of death. He directed Crawford to the center of the trap, positioning him precisely so the fall would be clean. Deputies moved in to bind his legs with leather straps, ensuring he would not thrash or kick on the way down. Crawford stood rigid, allowing them to secure him. He did not struggle. He did not tremble. His pulse was visible in his neck, but his face remained a mask. "Have you anything to say, Bill?" Lawson asked, his voice low, intended only for the men on the platform. Crawford looked at the crowd one last time. He saw the faces upturned, mouths open, hungry for the drop. He looked at the sky, the vast expanse of the Indian Territory stretching out beyond the prison walls. He looked at the priest, who was murmuring a final prayer. He felt the absurdity of the moment, the expectation that he should offer some profound remorse, a confession of sin, or a final sermon to the multitude. He had lived by the gun and the impulse. He would not die by the word. "This is about as good a day to die as any," Crawford said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence, projecting to the front rows of the spectators. "Goodbye, all you chums down that way." The simplicity of the statement silenced the few hecklers in the yard. It was the ultimate rejection of their judgment. He denied them the spectacle of a confession. He denied them the satisfaction of his repentance. He was Cherokee Bill, and he would die as he had lived, on his own terms, cold, defiant, and entirely self-contained. Lawson nodded, accepting the refusal. He placed the black hood over Crawford's head, plunging the outlaw into sudden, suffocating darkness. The world of light, of color, and of faces vanished, replaced by the weave of the fabric and the sound of his own breathing. The noose was adjusted around his neck. Crawford felt the rough hemp against his skin. The knot was positioned behind his left ear, designed to snap the vertebrae instantly upon the drop, a technical mercy in a brutal process. "Stand steady," Lawson murmured, stepping back to the lever. Crawford stood. He did not sway. He waited in the darkness for the sound of the mechanism. He did not pray aloud. If he made peace with his creator, he did so in the privacy of his own mind. At 13 minutes past 2, Lawson pulled the heavy iron handle. The trapdoor fell away with a deafening crash, the hinges shrieking under the sudden release of weight. Crawford dropped 6 feet. The rope snapped taut with a vibration that hummed through the timber of the scaffold. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a sudden wind sweeping through a canyon. The body of Cherokee Bill hung suspended in the air. He did not thrash. He did not kick. The knot had done its work efficiently. His neck was broken. Consciousness was extinguished in the fraction of a second it took for the rope to arrest his fall. He spun slowly at the end of the line, a pendulum of black cloth and stillness against the backdrop of the prison wall. The violence that had defined his life, the rage that had killed men in dance halls, train cars, and jail cells was finally, irrevocably stilled. The crowd watched in silence. They waited for the twitch, the struggle that sometimes accompanied a botched hanging. But there was none. The drop had been perfect. The silence in the yard stretched out, heavy and oppressive. The only sound was the creaking of the rope against the beam. The physician approached the body, stepping onto a small stool to reach the chest of the suspended man. He placed a hand over the heart, feeling for the fading rhythm. The crowd watched the doctor's face, waiting for the signal. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The heart of the young outlaw was strong, fighting a losing battle against the trauma to the spinal cord. Finally, at 2:30 p.m., the doctor stepped back and nodded to the marshal. "He is dead," the doctor pronounced. The body was cut down. It was placed in a plain wooden coffin, the black hood still covering the face that had launched 1,000 manhunts. The coffin was loaded onto a wagon. Ellen Lynch was waiting at the gate to claim him. She took the body of her son, the boy who had been born in the shadow of the Buffalo Soldiers and died in the shadow of the gallows. She took him back to the Cherokee Nation, to be buried in the rocky soil near Fort Gibson, close to the place where he had killed Jake Lewis and started his long fall. The execution of Cherokee Bill marked the definitive end of an era in the Indian Territory. The wild, chaotic days of the outlaw gangs were fading. The railroad, the telegraph, and the federal court had won the war of attrition. The senseless killer kid had been erased, removed from the equation by the cold arithmetic of the law. The capture and execution of Bill Cook shortly before, and now the death of his most lethal enforcer, signaled that the West was closing. But the memory of the hanging lingered in Fort Smith. The citizens who dispersed from the prison yard walked away with a strange sense of unease. They had seen justice done, yes. A murderer had been punished. But they had also seen a young man barely out of his teens face death with a composure that was terrifying in its absolute negation of fear. They realized that the line between the monster and the man was thinner than they cared to admit. Crawford Goldsby had killed for money, for anger, for pride, and finally just for the sake of killing. He had left a trail of bodies from the Arkansas River to the Verdigris. He had terrorized the Iron Horse and mocked the marshals. In the end, his violence achieved nothing. He did not liberate his people. He did not get rich. He did not find peace. He simply created a void, a space where lives used to be, and then fell into that void himself. The sun began to set on Fort Smith, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty gallows. The rope was gone. The trapdoor was closed. The birds returned to roost on the courthouse roof, their calls sounding sharp in the cooling air. The world continued to turn, indifferent to the life that had just been extinguished. The story of Cherokee Bill was over, written in blood, and ended with a snap of hemp. Yet in the quiet of the evening, in the saloons along the riverfront and the parlors of the respectable houses, the people spoke his name. They told the stories again, the shot at the barber, the fight in the jail, the final words on the scaffold. The fear he had inspired transmuted into legend. He became a ghost story to frighten children, a cautionary tale for young men with hot tempers and access to guns. The legacy of Cherokee Bill was not one of heroism, but of waste. He was a weapon that had fired until it was empty, and then was discarded by the times. The West was changing. The open range was being fenced. The tribes were being allotted and dissolved. The outlaws were being hanged or imprisoned. Crawford Goldsby was a relic of a savage time, a spark that burned too hot and went out too fast. As the night settled, over the fresh grave in Fort Gibson, the wind blew through the grass, the same wind that had howled outside the cabin at Noata and whistled through the cracks of the jail in Fort Smith. It carried no judgment, only the red dust of the plains. Under the earth, the hands that had held the Winchester and the Colt were still. The eyes that had looked with indifference on the suffering of others were closed forever. The senseless killer kid was at rest, leaving behind a scar on the history of the frontier that would never fully heal. The hangman's noose had finished the job, but the darkness Cherokee Bill brought into the world remained, a shadow that stretched long after the sun had gone down.